Without objection, the chair may declare the committee in recess at any point. Without objection, the chairman of the Subcommittee on Counterterrorism, Law Enforcement, and Intelligence, Mr. Pfluger, and the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Magaziner, will be afforded 5 minutes each to make opening statements. The purpose of this hearing is to receive testimony on the threats posed by the Iranian regime to the homeland. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. There is no doubt that the Iranian regime poses a significant threat to the United States homeland and to our allies. This threat is real and it is growing. Tehran continues to furnish weapons, funding, and training to its surrogates across the globe who engage in heinous acts of terror. On October 7th of this year, which coincided with the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, the world witnessed the horrific and grotesque atrocities that occurred in Israel. Hamas, a genocidal terrorist organization backed by the Iranian regime, launched this deadly, multi-pronged land, air, and sea attack inside Israel, with terrorists infiltrating Israel's southern border and firing thousands of rockets from Gaza. Over 1,400 Israelis were killed, with a significant number being innocent civilians, women, children, and the elderly. More than 2,800 Israelis have been wounded, including some in critical condition. At least 32 Americans were killed in Israel, and an unknown number of Americans are also being held as hostages by Hamas. The sheer brutality of these acts of terror is horrific. It's hard to watch the videos. Hamas terrorists hunted down hundreds of young people innocently celebrating at a music festival to murder and rape them. They killed a grandmother and then used her phone to post her murder on her own Facebook page. They murdered a young man, and his girlfriend filmed the murder on the man's phone and texted the barbaric video to his mother. They raped and murdered women and then paraded their bodies in the streets. These monsters murdered and burned helpless babies. They massacred whole families. These innocent people were killed for merely living in the state of Israel and being Jewish. Let me be clear to anyone who's listening. Hamas isn't motivated by some territorial dispute. Much like Nazi Germany, these terrorists are driven by a deep hatred of the Jewish people. Their stated goal, as mentioned in their charter, is the annihilation of the state of Israel and the extinction of the Jewish people. As we are currently seeing, Hamas routinely uses civilians, women, and children as human shields. The whole world must see and hear exactly what happened. It is disgusting and appalling that so many apologists have not condemned these barbaric acts of terror. I've been shocked at the horrifying anti-Semitism being displayed in some of our cities, on our college campuses, and even in the halls of Congress. Anything but a complete condemnation of Hamas and their brutal atrocities is unacceptable. We must stand with the state of Israel and give our unwavering support as Israel defends itself against the heinous attacks by Hamas. We also must condemn the forces behind Hamas, the Iranian regime. The Iranian regime is the muscle and the money empowering this reign of terror. For years, the Iranian regime has provided financial, military, political, and diplomatic support to various proxies, including Hamas. They use these terrorist groups to attack Israel and Americans and our interests across the globe, even in our own backyard. The Iranian regime and its surrogates maintain a presence in the Western Hemisphere. Just this year, the Iranian Navy docked warships in Rio de Janeiro, and the regime held high-level meetings in the capitals of Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. Iranian-backed Hezbollah also maintains a presence in the region. The terror group has operated throughout South America for decades and has carried out attacks on Israeli targets in Argentina. Hezbollah has also worked closely with the drug cartels in Latin America to traffic drugs across the globe and launder money for these transnational criminal organizations. These threats are closer than most Americans realize. And that's because of our porous southwest border. Under President Biden and Secretary Mayorkas, the volume of known gotaway crossing our border has skyrocketed. And so has the number of individuals who appear on the known or suspected terrorist watch list and the number of special interest aliens, which are people from countries identified as having conditions that promote and protect terrorism or possibly present a national security threat to this country. I'm extremely concerned that terrorists will exploit these glaring vulnerabilities at our southwest border to attempt attacks inside the United States. Just a few weeks ago, one human smuggling group with significant ties to ISIS moved Uzbeki nationals into the United States, and some of these individuals smuggled into our country still remain at large. This should concern every single one of us. This administration's policies and its misguided decisions have appeased tyrants and created significant national security vulnerabilities. The Biden administration's display of weakness on the world stage, from the catastrophic withdrawal from Afghanistan, weak posture towards Russia before the invasion of Ukraine, to reckless negotiations with Iran, threatens our homeland security and our national interests. History's clear. Appeasement doesn't work. While the Biden administration was busy cutting deals with the Iranian regime, Hamas was preparing for its attacks. Kowtowing to tyrants and their proxies is always a mistake. This administration is continuing to repeat the same mistakes of the past. The Trump administration was right to remove the United States from the flawed Iran nuclear deal and to reimpose sanctions. It was also right to eliminate Qasem Soleimani, who was responsible for the deaths of thousands, including hundreds of U.S. troops in Iraq. My friends, these decisive actions told the Iranian regime that real consequences come when you threaten the United States. That message has been lost under this administration, and our adversaries know it. As I indicated at the onset, the Iranian regime's threats to the homeland are real and are growing. They've sought to conduct cyber attacks on our state and local governments and private industry. The regime continues to pursue an opportunistic approach to cyber warfare, which makes the United States and our allies' critical infrastructure susceptible to that attack. They've plotted to target and assassinate individuals inside the United States, including former Trump officials. They've also sought to abduct or assassinate Iranians living in the United States who are critical of their regime, such as Masih Alinejad, an Iranian-American journalist testifying before the committee today. The Iranian regime is becoming more determined and more adept in its malicious activity. We must remain vigilant. Now I'd like to deviate for a second from my script and just say to the Iranian people who are freedom-loving, we know of your suffering, and you are in our prayers. Thank you all, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here this morning. I look forward to your unvarnished testimony, your objective perspective about the threats the Iranian regime poses and what actions we need to take to counter these threats. I now recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, for his opening statement.
Thank you very much. Good morning to our witnesses. We're glad to have you. As we begin today's hearing on Iran's threat to our homeland, I want to express my deepest condolences in the wake of the horrific terrorist attack in Israel. On October 7th, Hamas, a proxy of the Iranian regime, tragically slaughtered more than 1,400 men, women, and children, including at least 30 Americans. We pray for them and their loved ones. We also pray for the innocent civilians who died in Gaza and are mindful of the humanitarian crisis there. As I said in the immediate aftermath of the heinous attacks, the United States condemns Hamas actions and stand in total solidarity with Israel against terror. Since the attacks, President Biden and his administration have shown true leadership, not just words, but action, demonstrating ironclad support for Israel. The President has deployed 2 aircraft carriers groups to the Eastern Mediterranean and sent Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and Secretary of State Anthony Blinken to the region to signal strong support for Israel's security and engage in critical diplomacy. The President himself traveled to Israel to reaffirm the United States' commitment to Israel's security. He's also made clear he has no higher priority than getting back the Americans who went missing in the attacks. Unfortunately, as the Biden administration has worked to support Israel, bring Americans home from the conflict zone, prevent a wider war in the region, and address the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, the House of Representatives has been AWOL. Because of their failure to elect a speaker for the last 22 days, the House has been unable to conduct any legislative business. I thank our witnesses for coming back to this hearing. I know you were here last week. Some flew in from California, but such as it is, maybe we'll have that issue resolved today. I hope so. We need to get on with the business. We haven't even been able to pass a bipartisan resolution in support of Israel, of which I'm a co-sponsor, authored by Mr. McCall and the ranking member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, Mr. Meeks. Some of my colleagues on the other side have acknowledged this extraordinary, troubling situation. The former chairman of this committee, Mr. McCall, who currently chairs the Committee on Foreign Affairs, recently said, and I quote, "I look at the world and all the threats that are out there, and what kind of a message are we sending to our adversaries when we can't govern, when we are dysfunctional, when we don't even have a Speaker of the House?" I agree with Mr. McCall. He is correct about Republican dysfunction and the message it sends to our adversaries around the world. Unfortunately, Republicans are trying to deflect attention from their own infighting by criticizing the Biden administration. For example, we've heard misleading statements about the administration giving Iran access to $6 billion in Iranian assets currently held in Qatari accounts. The truth is, not a penny of that money has been released, and the Biden administration and the Qatari government have agreed to block Iran from accessing it. Republicans are also engaging in fear-mongering about Hamas-affiliated individuals at our southwest border. The truth is, CBP has confirmed that no indication of Hamas-directed foreign fighters trying to enter the United States. I hope that congressional Republicans will stop their politically motivated criticism of the administration and instead focus their energy on electing a speaker so the House can pass legislation to help the people of Israel and strengthen the U.S. national security. There's much to be done as Iran and other adversaries like Russia, North Korea, and China continue to pose serious threats to the United States. As we examine Iran's threat to the homeland today, I'm concerned about targeted terror attacks from Iran and its proxies like Hamas and Hezbollah. Terrorism-related concerns about Iran are well-founded. According to the U.S. State Department, Iran is the largest state sponsor of terrorism. The Iranian regime has implicated in assassinations, terrorist plots, and terrorist attacks in more than 40 countries since 1979, including several plots or attempted attacks in the United States against Americans. I'm also concerned about the Iranian regime's cyber threats to the homeland. According to the U.S. intelligence community's 2023 annual threat assessment, and I quote, "Iran's growing expertise and willingness to conduct aggressive cyber operations make it a major threat to the security of the U.S. and allied networks and data. I'm particularly concerned about Iran's opportunistic approach to cyber attacks and whether U.S. critical infrastructure is susceptible for targeting by this regime. To discuss these issues today, I'm grateful we have Mr. Thomas Warwick on our witness panel. Mr. Warwick has 40 years of experience addressing threats from Iran. including more than a decade at the Department of Homeland Security dedicated to counterterrorism efforts. I look forward to hearing his assessment of the most significant threats to the homeland from Iran and steps Congress should take to address these threats. I thank the entire panel for joining us today. Mr. Chairman, in closing, I want to say that I hope Republicans can overcome their chaos and dysfunctions so that we can return to regular order and resume the work of the American people sent us here to do. It's long overdue. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the ranking member for his statement, and I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Pfluger, for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Chairman Green, for holding this important hearing, for bringing us together with experts that have long advocated for strength, have long advocated for a policy of deterrence and not appeasement. This hearing, unfortunately, is occurring in the aftermath after a heinous terrorist attack on our ally, our strongest ally in the Middle East, Israel. And what we witnessed on the tragic morning of October the 7th was nothing short of barbaric and horrible. It was the deadliest day since the creation of the State of Israel 75 years ago. And it was the deadliest day for Jewish people since the Holocaust. Israelis, Americans, and other foreign nationals died. Many were injured, and others continue to be held hostage, and their whereabouts are unknown. At least 32 Americans were killed in this attack. Let me repeat that. At least 32 Americans were killed in this attack, which makes October the 7th the worst attack on Americans by international terrorism since 9/11. More Americans were killed on October 7th than in the attacks on Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia in 1996, the USS Cole in 2000, the U.S. Embassy in Beirut in 1983, or the embassies in East Africa in 1998. What happened on October 7th was sickening. These evil and twisted Hamas terrorists, a foreign terrorist organization supported by the Iranian regime, who carried out this cruel and indiscriminate attack that targeted innocent women, babies, children, the elderly, and the entire Jewish population. These attacks should be universally and unequivocally condemned by all, and unfortunately, that has not happened. It's absolutely appalling to see mass gatherings celebrating the loss of life that took place that heartbreaking morning. These gatherings are nothing more than an attempt to not only whitewash the gruesome attacks, but also to deny what transpired on that morning and to push a narrative that could not be further from the truth. New York Mayor Eric Adams recently said, "We are not all right when Hamas believes that they are fighting on behalf of something in their destructive, despicable action that carried out. We are not all right when we still have hostages who have not come home to their family. We are not all right, and we're not going to say we have stiff upper lip and act like everything is fine. Everything is not fine. Israel has a right to defend itself, and that's the right that we know." And I applaud him for saying those words. The hateful rhetoric spewed at these gatherings have created an environment that has left Jewish communities isolated and concerned about their sense of safety and security. We must make it clear that every American has a right to live peacefully and securely in this nation. In addition, the horrific images from Israel that we have seen should invoke the raw emotions that many Americans felt in the fight against terrorism. It's a solemn reminder, and especially on this committee that was formed and created to help ensure that another attack like 9/11 never occurs again on our homeland. As I reflect on the recent tragedy that has unfolded in Israel, I cannot help but remember how the 9/11 Commission report explained that a contributing factor as to why we missed the threat indicators to foresee an attack on our nation was due to a lack of imagination from our intelligence agencies and national security experts. No one in our government could even remotely think that someone would use a commercial airliner as a missile. Yet we saw 4 commercial jets utilized on that morning of 9/11. And when you think you've seen it all, violent extremists are there to prove you wrong. Like before 9/11, none of us could imagine that terrorists would fly across the southern border on paragliders and slaughter innocent civilians celebrating life at a music festival. Yet these terrorists bulldozed and blew holes through concrete barriers, and thousands of terrorists ran through with little to no effort to begin their brutal assault. These attacks, unfortunately, have taught the world that violent Islamic terrorists are continuing to exploit vulnerabilities in the most ingenious ways. We must not lose sight of this reality, and we have to acknowledge the threats posed by these groups. We must also recognize that these threats pose a significant danger to the United States as well. Our border is far less secure than Israel. I know this because I personally led efforts to help promote the development of border technology between our two nations. The fact that even the most advanced technology could not stop these atrocities from taking place in Israel should keep us up at night here. Our nation has seen a record number of individuals encountered who have either appeared on the known or suspected terrorist watch list or individuals designated as special interest aliens. Just this year, over 150 people that we know about have been encountered at the southern border that match the terror watch list. President Biden must reverse course on his failed Iran policy. Appeasement does not work. We do not negotiate with terrorists. We know firsthand that the Iranian regime has tried to exploit weaknesses in our southwest border. Surely there is a risk that terrorists, including those backed by the Iranian regime, could take advantage of the glaring vulnerabilities and conduct attacks right here in our homeland. If we continue to remain naive about the security posture at our southwest border, then we are bound to suffer the catastrophic consequences that we just saw in Israel. The threat warnings and indicators from terrorist attacks in Israel should serve as a wake-up call to our nation and make us realize that these dangers are present, that they are real. We must secure our southwest border immediately. I would also be remiss if I did not highlight the fact that the Iranian regime is actively targeting Americans here on our soil. They have the desire, and I think they have proven through the greenlighting of Hamas that they have the capacity. The regime has attempted multiple times to silence or exact revenge on government officials and private citizens who speak out against the regime's brutality. And I think we'll hear about that today. Multiple witnesses today have experienced this transnational repression firsthand, and I look forward to hearing that. Lastly, we must also recognize that authoritarian regimes like China, like the Chinese Communist Party, and like Russia are working to advance their strategic goals throughout the Middle East. The Biden administration has failed to lead on the global stage time and time again. And we have demonstrated time and time again through the administration's failed policies to malign actors that talk is cheap and that we will not take.
Mr. Chairman, point of order.
Sure. He's making an opening statement.
If
There's
you
no
read the
time limit on an opening statement.
If you read the conference rule,
Very well.
if you read our committee rules, then you'd know that opening statements can go over 5 minutes.
Yeah, go ahead, buddy.
Very well.
Time and time again, we have demonstrated to malign actors that our talk is cheap and that we will not take the hard work necessary to deter evil influences. We must use our leadership to reject these narratives and put on notice those who would rather sympathize with terrorists and refuse to condemn the worst attack against the Jewish people since the Holocaust. I hope that our nation comes together and supports our indispensable ally, Israel, and the Jewish communities across the globe grieving during these trying times. We must also continue to work to rid the world of hateful and anti-Semitic ideology, and I'm calling on my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to do just that, because there are 9 people in this Congress who have refused to do that. 9 people who, when we go to the floor to vote on a resolution supporting our greatest ally, Israel, that intend to vote against that resolution supporting Israel, that voted against a resolution earlier this summer saying that Israel was not an apartheid nation, that Israel was not a racist nation, and that in fact Israel was our greatest ally. And I'm calling on you all to help bring us together to condemn terrorist attacks regardless of who commits them. The security and safety for Jewish people and the state of Israel are non-negotiable. Mr. Chairman, the only strategy that works is peace through strength. the failed policies of the Obama administration with a weak nuclear deal, the failed policies of appeasement, delivering cash, allowing oil sanctions and other sanctions to expire, have set the stage for where we are today. The Biden administration must reverse course, and it starts with rhetoric, and it's followed by policy. And I hope that this committee in this hearing today can let the American people know that we do not and will not allow terrorists to control the narrative, and that we will use peace through strength. I yield back.
The gentleman yields, and thank him for his opening statement. I now recognize the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Magaziner, for his opening statement.
Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Thompson, go ahead. I want to thank you for convening today's hearing. The topic, the Iranian regime's threats to Homeland Security, is both timely and important. The Iranian regime is a danger to global stability and our own Homeland Security. It is the world's most prolific supporter of terrorism and determined to harm the United States and our allies. Today, we have an opportunity to explore exactly how Iran and its proxies seek to carry out their destructive ambitions and to move toward meaningful bipartisan actions to counter and contain them. This hearing comes at an important moment. Earlier this month, on October 7th, an Iranian-backed terrorist group, Hamas, launched a gruesome attack against civilians in Israel. These brutal terrorists murdered innocent civilians. They slaughtered hundreds of young people at a music festival. They kidnapped Holocaust survivors and children and U.S. citizens. Make no mistake, as President Biden said, the United States of America stands firmly and unequivocally with Israel and against the evil that is Hamas. This terrorist organization is a threat not just to Israel, but also to the United States and our allies across the world. Iran and its proxies present a clear and present danger to our homeland security, and we must identify ways that the United States can ensure the safety of our citizens abroad and here at home. Iran has attempted to conduct multiple assassinations on U.S. soil, including of U.S. persons. Multiple plots orchestrated by Iran have been dismantled in recent years, including an attempted bombing of a restaurant right here in Washington, D.C. Perhaps the most commonly used tactic by the Iranian regime is cyber warfare, as they seek to target U.S. businesses and infrastructure and government agencies with disruptive attacks. They and their proxies, like Hamas, are adept at using the internet to incite people to violence in Israel, in the United States, and elsewhere. And we know that individuals online supporting violence against both the Jewish community and the Muslim community here in the United States are being manipulated by Iran and its proxies to conduct acts of violence here in the United States. This is reprehensible, and we must redouble our efforts to combat terrorist organizations' ability to radicalize individuals here at home in the United States through the internet. I'll just say on a personal note, as a person of Jewish heritage, as someone who has experienced anti-Semitism and who just a few weeks ago, we had a bomb threat at the largest synagogue in my city that I live in Rhode Island. Thankfully, the individual who called in that bomb threat was arrested. I get chills when I hear the rhetoric being used by those who are seeking to commit acts of violence against Jewish people in the United States and around the world. The same chills that I felt on that day when white supremacists marched in Charlottesville, Virginia, chanting, "Jews will not replace us." And President Trump got up at the end of that day and said that there were fine people on both sides. So if we are going to call out anti-Semitism, if we're going to call out domestic violent extremism and the incitement of violence, yes, let's be prepared to do it everywhere. Let's not make this a partisan exercise, but an American one. We must also work to prevent the targeting of Iranian dissidents here in the United States. Ms. Alinejad, thank you for being here today. I know that each time you speak out, and particularly in Congress, You put yourself at great risk, but your story is one that the American people need to hear. I am deeply troubled that the Iranian regime has the audacity to continue to try to reach inside the United States to harm you and other people, including a former Secretary of State who live freely in this country. But your presence here today demonstrates that their efforts will only redouble ours in resisting any acts of political assassination or violence on U.S. soil. We owe it to you and all the victims of the Iranian regime, including in Israel and Gaza, to set aside politics and work together in a bipartisan manner to contain and counter the Iranian regime and its proxies. Congress must also work to ensure the Iranian regime's reach never reaches our homeland to bring harm to our own people. The U.S. and Israel's intelligence and counterintelligence efforts failed to detect and prevent the attack that ensued on October 7th. And as a country, we need assurances that there will not be another intelligence failure that has the capacity to harm Americans, either abroad or in our own homeland. That means empowering the Department of Homeland Security's intelligence enterprise, as Mr. Warwick notes in his written testimony, and ensuring that DHS has the full capacity necessary with appropriate privacy and civil rights and civil liberties checks to gather intelligence on Iranian activities and other security threats here in the United States homeland. It means ensuring that fusion centers are equipped to share intelligence with state, local, tribal, and territorial law enforcement who are on the ground protecting American communities. And it means making sure that no one in this country is harmed simply because they dare to speak out against the Iranian regime. I know my Democratic colleagues and I are prepared to work with anyone who is serious about making our country safer, freer, and more open. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields, and I thank him for his statement, and I thank him for his heart that was obvious. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. I'm pleased to have an important panel of witnesses before us today, and I ask that our witnesses please rise and raise their right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before the Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you. You may be seated. I would now like to formally introduce our witnesses. Ambassador Nathan Sales is the founder and principal of Fillmore Global Strategies, a consultancy firm that provides legal and strategic advisory services on matters surrounding law, policy, and diplomacy. He is also a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, a member of the advisory board at the Vandenberg Coalition, and a senior advisor at the Sufan Group. Ambassador Sales is a former government official who served in various senior positions at the U.S. Department of State. He was the coordinator for counterterrorism and special envoy to the Global Coalition to defeat ISIS, in charge for leading and coordinating U.S. efforts to counter terrorism and violent extremism worldwide. He also served as the acting undersecretary for the Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights, managing 9 bureaus and offices that advance U.S. interests on issues such as human rights, rule of law, conflict prevention, and countering transnational threats. Prior to joining the State Department, Ambassador Sales was a tenured law professor at Syracuse University College of Law, where he taught and wrote on national security law, counterterrorism law, constitutional law, and administrative law. He also worked as a lawyer at Kirkland & Ellis and as a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy at the Department of Homeland Security. Ms. Masih Alinejad is an Iranian-American journalist and women's rights activist known for her tireless promotion of freedom and democracy in her native country. Her work focuses on the status of human rights in Iran, especially women's rights. Time magazine named her among its 2023 honorees for Woman of the Year. Ms. Alinejad was born and raised in a small village in Iran and was politically active from a young age. She began her career as a journalist within the country, writing critically of the regime for various Iranian newspapers. She fled Iran in 2009 and in 2014 launched My Stealthy Freedom, an independent, nonprofit organization dedicated to the promotion of Iranian women's actions to secure their rights. Despite the Iranian regime's multiple attempts to silence her, Ms. Ahmadinejad continues to speak out for freedom and liberty for all Iranians, women and men. Mr. Robert Greenway currently serves as the director of the Center for National Defense at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Greenway has over 30 years' experience in public service, culminating as the senior U.S. government official responsible for developing, coordinating, and implementing U.S. government policy for all the Middle East and North Africa on the National Security Council. Prior to service on the National Security Council, he served as a senior intelligence officer at the Defense Intelligence Agency and a veteran of the United States Army Special Forces with 6 combat tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. While Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director of the National Security Council's Middle Eastern and North African Affairs Directorate, he planned and executed the United States' most significant economic sanctions since the Cold War as part of a broad strategy for Iran. He was a principal architect of the historic Abraham Accords, the most significant diplomatic breakthrough in the Middle East since 1994. Mr. Greenway also personally supervised development of a first-ever presidentially approved strategies for Iran, Syria, Iraq, Libya, Lebanon, and Israel, and established the first national-level efficacy, and assessment process to quantify outcomes and measure progress towards strategic objectives. Mr. Thomas Warwick is the director of the Future of DHS project at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security's Forward Defense Practice and a non-resident senior fellow and the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Previously, he was the acting director of the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative in the Atlantic Council's Middle East programs. Prior to joining the Atlantic Council from August of 2008 to 2019, he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism at DHS. From 1997 to 2007, he served in the U.S. Department of State on Middle East and international justice issues. In 2001, he became Special Advisor, then Senior Advisor, to the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, working on Iraq, Iran, and other issues. From July 2006 to 2007, he was Director for Iraq Political Affairs. He was briefly Senior Political Advisor on the Iran desk in 2007. Mr. Warwick joined DHS in August 2007 as Director for the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia in the Office of Policy. He became Deputy Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism Policy in the Office of Policy in August 2008. In February 2015, Mr. Warwick was named Deputy Counterterrorism Coordinator for Policy by the DHS Counterterrorism Coordinator and Undersecretary for Intelligence and Analysis. I thank all the witnesses. It's very clear we have some very talented individuals here today, and I look forward to your testimony. I now recognize Ambassador Sales for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Chairman Green, Ranking Member Thompson, and members of the committee, it's an honor to speak with you today about the threat posed by the Iranian regime, an issue even more urgent after the diabolical attack on Israel. On October 7th, Iran's proxy, Hamas, massacred more than 1,400 people and took some 200 hostages. As we've heard, it was the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. It was also a dark day for America, with now at least 33 of our citizens killed. October 7th was the deadliest attack on Americans by foreign terrorists since 9/11, and the 4th deadliest such attack in our history. Make no mistake, Iran's fingerprints are all over it. The Islamic Republic of Iran is the world's worst state sponsor of terrorism. The threat it poses reaches from the Middle East to the entire world, including the United States. Right now, as we speak, Iran is plotting to assassinate a number of former officials here on American soil, including John Bolton and Mike Pompeo. And as we've heard, last year, Tehran tried to murder one of today's witnesses, the heroic Masih Ahmadinejad. A decade earlier, Iran tried to assassinate the Saudi ambassador by bombing a restaurant in Georgetown. If successful, the attack would have killed countless Americans. Tehran didn't care. One of the plotters said, quote, "They want that guy done. If the 100 go with him, F him. Note that Iran is trying to exploit vulnerabilities in our southern border. In the Bolton plot, it planned to use a Mexican national with ties to drug cartels. It also attempted to use a Mexican cartel in the plot against the Saudi ambassador. Other terrorists could target these vulnerabilities too. CBP has reported a dramatic spike in watch-listed individuals caught crossing the southern border. 0 in 2019, 3 in 2020, then 15 in 21, 98 in 22, and 169 this year. And those are just the ones we know about. How many others were able to enter the country undetected? Then there's Hezbollah, Iran's top terror proxy. Between 1997 and 2020, 128 suspected Hezbollah operatives were arrested in our country. Others are probably here too, hiding in plain sight and awaiting activation orders from their masters in Tehran. Which brings us to the horror in Israel. Iran is encircling the Jewish state with an army of terrorist proxies. In Lebanon, it has spent decades bankrolling Hezbollah with some $700 million a year. In Gaza, Iranian help has dramatically improved Hamas's capabilities. This year, its support to Hamas reportedly topped $350 million. Why does this matter to the United States? Well, first, we have a vital interest in ensuring that our ally Israel is secure against enemies that seek its extermination. When Hamas and its supporters say they want a Palestinian state from the river to the sea, what they're really saying is Israel has no right to exist at all. They're saying they want the region to be cleansed of Jews, or, as you might put it in German, a Palestine that is Judenrein. Second, we have common enemies. The Iranian proxies that want to slaughter Israelis want to slaughter us too. In all, Hamas has killed at least 79 Americans in at least 30 attacks stretching back to the 1990s. So what should we do? First, the administration needs to deter Iran from plotting assassinations on our soil. In 1993, Saddam Hussein tried to assassinate former President Bush. President Clinton retaliated by launching 23 Tomahawk cruise missiles at Iraq's intelligence service. As President Clinton explained, quote, "From the first days of our revolution, America's security has depended on the clarity of this message. Don't tread on us." Saddam got the message. Now, no one is saying we should bomb Tehran, but the regime should have more to fear from us than a stern press release. Second, the administration should use sanctions to stanch the flow of money to terrorism. The Iranian regime is richer today than it has been in years. In 2021, its accessible foreign currency reserves were down to $4 to $6 billion, roughly the same as Haiti. Now the IMF estimates that its reserves will hit $43 billion this year. In August 2020, Tehran was exporting an average of 749,000 barrels of oil a day. This August, nearly 2 million a day. In all, it's estimated that Iran has sold $80 billion worth of oil since January of 2021, much of it going to communist China. 80 billion can buy a lot of bombs. Sanctions work. After the previous administration squeezed Iran's economy, money for terrorism dried up. In 2019, Hezbollah's leader was reduced to going on TV and pleading for donations. I'll end where I began. Let's be clear, the Islamic Republic is responsible for the attack in Israel. Its exact role may not be clear at the moment, but that doesn't really matter. It certainly enabled the attack, providing Hamas with money and weapons and training precisely so it could commit terrorism like this. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, and members of the committee, thank you again, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ambassador Sills. I now recognize Ms. Alina Jad for 5 minutes to summarize her opening statement.
Chairman Green, Ranking Member Thompson, and distinguished members of the committee, I'm very honored to be here alongside all of you, talking about important issue, Iran's threat to the region and to the homeland security. By listening to all of you speakers, my heart is broken because I love Iran. And I heard that my beloved country, Iran's name, being mentioned in all of your talk regarding to terrorist act. On behalf of millions of Iranians, I'm here to tell you that it's not Iran backing the terrorists. The people of Iran are standing in solidarity with the people of Israel. We, the people of Iran, are hostage in the hand of this terrorist regime. Islamic Republic, Hamas, do not talk for the people of Iran and people of Palestine. Last month, I had the privilege to testify before a subcommittee of the House Foreign Affairs Committee on the Iranian regime's oppression against people. And I emphasized the resilience of the people of Iran fighting the oppressive clerical regime. The murder of Mahsa Jina Amini in the hand of morality police for the crime of just showing a bit of her hair sparked a revolution called Women, Life, Freedom. Tragically, the regime's brutality continues. Another girl, Armita Gravand, only 16-year-old, now is in a coma after being beaten up by morality police again for not covering her hair. After my testimony last month, yes, you're right, I received death threats just because of being vocal against the terrorist regime of Iran. But I'm not alone. Other Americans have also come under attacks from the Iranian regime. We received death threats from Revolutionary Guards, Hamas, Hezbollah, Taliban on US soil. The Islamic Republic funds groups like Hamas and Hezbollah to carry out its terrorist agenda. They pose substantial threats not only to its regional neighbors, but also to the United States on US soil. Let me share just a bit of my experience. Growing up in Iran, I, like millions of Iranian children, I was forced, brainwashed, to chant death to America, death to Israel. Yes, I raised cursing Israel and America. But now my people in Iran, they are saying death to Islamic Republic. When I was a teenager, I got kicked out from schools. When I became a journalist, I got kicked out from parliament just because of criticizing the Islamic Republic. I kicked out from my homeland, Iran. I started my new life in America to be safe, to practice my freedom of speech here. But let's be honest with you. As an American citizen, I don't feel safe here at home anymore. My family doesn't feel safe anymore. Since 2021, I have been forced to relocate over a dozen times under the supervision of the FBI. 2 years ago, Iranian regime were plotting to kidnap me and take me from Brooklyn by a speedboat to a cargo ship bound for Venezuela and then to Iran. To you, maybe it's a scary movie, but to us, this is the reality. They did that to my colleague in France, and they executed him in Iran. I could have been one of them. This brought great hardship on myself, my husband, and my stepchildren. I thought after the FBI stopped the kidnapping plot, I'm gonna have a normal life. I was wrong. Last July, a man with AK-47 came to my house on my porch in Brooklyn, trying to kill me. The assassin, a member of an East European criminal gang. Yes, you heard me right. They're using criminal gang to do their dirty job on US soil. He was there, stalking, monitoring my activities, the activities of my children, my neighbors, my friends. Imagine if he had opened fire, how many of my neighbors would have been killed, American citizens on US soil. Today, the 3 assassins hired by the Islamic Republic are in jail, thanks to the FBI. An Iranian-American woman who financially helped the kidnapping plot received 4 years prison sentence. The Iranian regime has even targeted individuals who worked with me here in the US, including my chief of staff, Sardar Pashai, is sitting behind me. They arrested his brother for the crime of my chief of staff working with me on US soil, and he was tortured for 90 days. As one agent told me, Iranian regime is persistent and will try again and again. But as you hear, I'm not gonna keep silent. I have come to realize that even on US soil, being safe is too luxury for those of us who dare to criticize the terrorist regime in Iran. Iran's regime is threatening US citizens on US soil, but the administration's response has been very, very disappointing. in the aftermath of the assassination plot, no administration officials have ever reached out to me or other Iranian Americans facing the same threats. The White House warned me this year that there have been more than 31 credible threats against me on US soil, but their advice for me was just go under witness protection. And what witness protection means? Means I have to change my name, my social security number, my identity, and get lost, disappear. That's not in my DNA. I understand that they want to protect me, but being silent is what the Islamic Republic wants. Here, I appeal for your help. The administration has a responsibility to combat terror and protect me and other Americans to express ourselves freely on US soil. It is important for the White House to acknowledge the threats posed by Iranian regime as national security threats. I ask that a dedicated office to be set up at the appropriate law enforcement agency to monitor Islamic Republic's threats on our homeland and protect Americans from the physical and cyber reach of Islamic regime. That would be a start for Americans to feel safe at home. Now, Hamas terrorist attacks on Israel should serve a wake-up call for all American allies. If the US and its allies do not get united to end terrorism now, terrorists will get united and end democracy. Thank you for holding a hearing on this important topic. And I want you to see this as a bipartisan issue and end Hamas Islamic Republic. Thank you so much, and I'm ready to answer any questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Lena Jad. I now recognize Mr. Greenway for his 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Chairman Green, Ranking Member Thompson, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity and privilege to testify before you today. The risk from the Islamic Republic of Iran and those acting on their behalf has expanded as the scope and scale of terrorism it has long sponsored. Though present since the 1979 revolution, the risk has increased dramatically in response to the dismantling of U.S. deterrence as the Biden administration initiated its policy of appeasement beginning in January 2021. Tehran's escalation reached a deadly peak 2 weeks ago. At least 33 Americans and 1,400 Israelis were killed, 13 American and 199 Israeli hostages taken as Hamas terrorists carried out an unprecedented terrorist attack in Israel on October 7th. According to multiple sources, the Islamic Republic of Iran helped plan and coordinate the operation executed by their surrogate Hamas, an organization they fund, trained, equip, and control. This is likely only the beginning. Former Hamas leader Khalid Mashal published an announcement on October the 10th calling on the global Muslim community to join the battle. Hamas itself has published a formal announcement calling on Arab and Muslim communities worldwide to mount a wide-scale uprising and advance toward the borders of Israel. We are not immune. The U.S. Border Patrol has encountered 72,000 special interest aliens on Americans' border over the past 2 years, many from the Middle East. Multiple Customs and Border Protection reports of apprehensions between ports of entry from October 21 to October 23 encountered 659 from Iran, 538 from Syria, 139 from Yemen, 123 from Iraq, and 164 from Lebanon. The ease with which Iran can exploit our open borders should not be underestimated, but we also should not forget that they were already here and expanding an already established operational presence. In fact, the first external assassination plot carried out by agents of the Islamic Republic of Iran took place outside our nation's capital in July 1980. The Islamic Republic is responsible for an estimated 52 attempted assassination attempts worldwide, resulting in at least 20 opponents abroad and hundreds killed in bombings of foreign military, diplomatic, and cultural facilities worldwide since 1979. Iran is clearly undeterred. It is pursuing assassination, abduction, terrorist, cyber, and surveillance plots in increasingly aggressive fashion. They are not paying a price for their conduct. As Secretary of Defense Austin testified before Congress in March, the United States has been attacked at that time by its surrogates 83 times since January 2021, resulting in only 4 responses. In just the last week, Iranian surrogates have conducted 13 attacks against U.S. forces in Syria and Iraq without response. As a matter of fact, they're being rewarded. Iran has received a total of $90 billion in previously sanctioned exports and ransom payments since 2021. The ultimate measure of any policy are the results. Hamas' abhorrent terrorist attack on Israel resulted in the deadliest day of history and the deadliest terrorist attack on American citizens since 9/11. The failure of the administration's Iran appeasement policies resulted in Israel's only declaration of war since 1973. We now stand on the precipice of a regional conflict which radically increases the threat to Americans abroad and here at home. As a result, I recommend the following: disrupt active operational cells and supporting cyber assets, degrade command, control, and communications infrastructure here and abroad, deny their funds and reinstate any statutory sanctions imposed with respect to Iran that were waived, suspended, reduced, or otherwise relieved, increase assets required to identify existing infrastructure within the United States, protect all former government officials and dissidents targeted by the Islamic Republic, leverage existing counterintelligence authorities to accelerate operational activity and disrupt hostile intelligence threats, especially in the cyber domain, preserve the capabilities of FISA Section 702 with the necessary reforms to protect the liberties of Americans. Lastly, secure our border by enacting H.R. 2. I thank you and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Greenway, for your testimony, and I now recognize Mr. Warwick for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Thompson, members of the committee, thank you for the honor to testify today. I would start, like my colleagues here, with condemning the October 7 Hamas terrorist attack, which has been discussed at length. Last week, President Biden and other U.S. government officials have been talking with the Israeli Prime Minister and others about the future of Gaza. It's important, I think we should all agree, that Iran should not determine the future of Gaza. Second, I want to salute the efforts by the Iranian people, women and men, to fight for life, freedom, and justice. The Iranian regime has chosen to make the United States an adversary. The Iranian people want to make different choices. Let me make 4 major points. First, Iran and its proxies are currently carrying out a campaign of hybrid warfare against the United States. The Director of National Intelligence said the same thing in the latest annual threat assessment. Second, we need to address the threat from the Iranian regime on a sustained bipartisan basis. This is how we won the Cold War and how we approach China today. For Iran, we need a sustainable bipartisan strategy, both defending Americans at home and turning Iran away from its destabilizing ambitions. Third, after October 7, we need to recognize that strategic surprise is still possible. Even the State of Israel, with all of its measures in place, was surprised by Hamas's attack. The so-called Iron Wall between Israel and Gaza did not protect Israel's citizens from the October 7 attack. The Iron Wall was not enough. We should learn that lesson too. Fourth, we need to understand Iran's peculiar sense of symmetry. Iran is not incomprehensible. The Iranian regime is not 10 feet tall, and the IRGC Quds Force, while dangerous and committed, is not lurking behind every tree. There are numerous examples of this in my testimony. Let me just highlight a few in the way Iran approaches its terrorist actions against us and our allies. After the January 2020 strike that killed Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian Supreme Leader ordered his Security Council to, quote, strike America directly and in exact proportion to the attack, close quote. In May 2018, after the United States started the maximum pressure campaign to reduce oil exports, Iran attacked tankers in May and June of 2019, then a Saudi oil pipeline, then the Saudi Abqaiq facilities that cut Saudi oil exports in half. In cyberspace, Stuxnet led to Iran targeting our industrial control systems. July 2012 sanctions on U.S. banks were followed by cyber attacks on U.S. banks. Wiper malware deleted data on Iranian oil industry computers, so Iran deleted data on Saudi computers. And while the United States supports human rights and freedom in Iran, this is important, we can't be surprised when the Iranian regime thinks it can interfere in our democracy. There is, of course, absolutely no moral equivalency in these two situations. None. The way to defeat the Iranian regime is to raise our defenses so that the regime's plots fail. Yeah, Mr. Chairman, in my written testimony, I go through the 3 most important types of threats Iran poses. Number 1, targeted assassinations and terrorist attacks. Number 2, cyber attacks and cyber threats. Here is where Iran could pull off a strategic surprise, especially against our private sector. 3, Iranian disinformation operations. This is another area where I'm concerned Iran may pull off a strategic surprise as we move closer to the next U.S. election. Mr. Chairman, let me highlight 7 steps I believe this committee can take to help address Iran's threats to the homeland. Number 1, work towards a bipartisan consensus to address the Iranian threat both at home and abroad. Number 2, focused on the most significant urgent threats, starting with increasing cybersecurity in the private sector. This committee should lead a national debate about whether we are devoting enough resources to cybersecurity, especially in the private sector. Number 3, renew the authorization of DHS's Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Office. This office does vital work. Iran is one of the few countries in the world that has used chemical weapons in the 1980s. I know this committee has done its part, but I believe the bill is now held up in the Senate by a single senator. I would urge you and other members of this committee to engage with that senator to break the logjam and send the bipartisan CWMD reauthorization to the president. Number 4, renew the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, Section 702, but with changes, as my colleague Mr. Greenway has just said. Section 702 is unequivocally the most timely, impactful, and cost-effective authority to obtain foreign intelligence on terrorists, spies, and weapons proliferators. Number 5, enact the House language in the Intelligence Authorization Act on DHS Intelligence and Analysis Collection Authority. I'm concerned that the comparable Senate language prohibits INA from doing any collection whatsoever. INA needs to ensure it does not infringe on constitutional rights. That is essential. But to deny INA any ability to collect information goes farther than it should. The House in this respect is correct and should stand by its provision. Number 5, Congress should extend DHS's and FAA's authorities to counter unmanned aerial systems. Hamas used drones to deadly effect against the Israeli iron wall in Gaza. Iranian operatives or its proxies might try to use UASs here in the United States. It's vital that Congress resolves the competing versions before these authorities expire at the end of this year. And finally, Congress should reauthorize the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standard, CFAS. This expired on July 28th. This important program gives DHS the authority to enforce security standards for the nation's chemical plants to make it harder for terrorists to get access to those facilities. Here again, Mr. Chairman, you and this committee have done your part. The bill is held up in the Senate by a single senator. I would urge the committee to engage with that senator to break this logjam and send your bipartisan reauthorization bill to the president right away. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Work. And again, thank you to all of our witnesses. This has been very good. Very much appreciate your wisdom and years of experience. Members will be recognized by order of seniority for their 5 minutes of questioning. An additional round of questioning may be called for by all members once everybody has been recognized. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. In 2013, Mansour Arbabster, an Iranian American with familial links to high-ranking members of the Quds Force, was sentenced to 25 years in federal court for conspiring to assassinate the Saudi Arabian ambassador to the United States. Mr. Arbabster and his Iranian conspirators attempted to contact an individual they believed to be a member of a Mexican drug cartel to coordinate the attack. This plot not only endangered Saudi Arabia's ambassador, but also innocent lives here in the United States. My question is for Ambassador Sales. Our nation is experiencing a record number of illegal aliens attempting to cross our southwest border, including special interest aliens and known suspected terrorists. Do you believe the Iranian regime or its proxies could utilize their relationships with Mexican cartels to exploit the vulnerabilities at our southwest border to commit nefarious acts here in the homeland?
Mr. Chairman, thanks for the question. I do share that concern. The Iranian regime is persistent. They have already tried on multiple occasions to exploit vulnerabilities at our southern border to carry out acts of terrorism. The assassination plot that you mentioned, the assassination plot against former National Security Advisor John Bolton, they are going to keep trying until we stop them.
In the 1.7 million known gotaways, and these are the individuals that Customs and Border Patrol actually sees and can count, this isn't the unknown gotaways, but in those individuals, the known gotaways, the unknown gotaways, what guarantees do we have that Hamas hasn't already penetrated those?
I don't think we have any guarantees, Mr. Chairman, and I think we have to assume the worst. We know that Iranian-linked terrorists have been found in the United States. I mentioned Hezbollah, 128 Hezbollah operatives arrested over the years by the FBI. Within that population of however many millions or hundreds of thousands of known gotaways, we should not assume that they are all perfectly clean.
Take a minute, if you don't mind, and just can you explain the relationship between the Iranian regime and the drug cartels?
I think one of the modus operandi that the regime is most closely associated with is hiding behind proxies. They hide behind terror proxies in the Middle East, such as Hezbollah, such as Iraqi militias that are currently launching attacks on Americans, as Mr. Greenway pointed out. But it's not just terror proxies. They also hide behind organized crime and get them to do their dirty work. As Ms. Alinejad pointed out, it was an Eastern European criminal syndicate that was involved in the attempted assassination of her. Mexican drug cartels or suspected Mexican drug cartels involved in the assassination plots against John Bolton and against the Saudi ambassador. So it's highly consistent with Iranian tradecraft to use these sorts of proxies and hide behind them.
Mr. Greenway, do you agree with the assessment of Ambassador Sales on the potential threat at the southwest border and that Iran could use that current open border to threaten Americans here at home?
There's no question, Mr. Chairman, and again, they've got a stated and a past record of doing exactly that. I would also note that there are surrogates and proxies, and Iran itself is engaged in criminal activity, and so it's not a surprise that they would make common cause with other criminal networks. And they have ample opportunity. The population of available agents that they could use in order to conduct operational activity has expanded dramatically.
I agree with some comments that the ranking member made in his opening statement about current known intelligence threats. As we've connected with CBP and their intelligence division, they have made that clear. However, I want to enter into the record by unanimous consent their situational awareness alert that they put out, advising their people to be on the watch for these individuals, both Hamas, and they shared Hamas patches, Hezbollah patches, because clearly the threat is real. And I'd like, with unanimous consent, to enter this into the record. Hearing no objection, so ordered. I'm actually going to do something I rarely do and yield back a little extra time. Maybe I'll give it to Mr. Ivey. But again, thank you for being here. And I now recognize the ranking member for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Warwick, in your opening statement, you talked about Iran and its impact on the people of Israel. What must Congress do, in your opinion, to support Israel in order to prevent a wider war in the region?
Well, I would note with great satisfaction the measures that the Biden administration has already taken, sending 2 aircraft carrier battle groups to make it very clear to our enemies, Hezbollah, Iran, whoever they may be, that they should take no steps to try to inflame the situation in the Middle East beyond what it already is. That will be very important. I think it's also important for us to make sure that the American people appreciate that protecting our computer networks and cybersecurity here at home is something that's an obligation for all of us to undertake. The National Cybersecurity Strategy will help. It needs to be fully funded. Yet there are still many things that Americans can do to make sure that our defenses are so strong that no Iranian cyber attack would be able to do damage to us. This will take vigilance. And then finally, there are obviously things that we as the American people need to do. As the President said, speaking out against anti-Semitism and Islamophobia is actually important for the security of the United States and American values. And I think that's something that all Americans can do as we hope that the situation is addressed and the war that Israel has had to declare against Hamas comes to a conclusion that will be a better world for the Middle East.
Thank you. Ambassador Sales, there's significant concern about the Iranian threat to our homeland. In your review of that threat, how would you suggest to this committee that we address it?
Well, thanks for the question, Ranking Member Thompson. I think the threat is significant. We've heard about several ongoing assassination plots. I think the most important thing that the United States government and this committee can do is reestablish deterrence. Iran is not currently deterred from carrying out these operations. And I think that the prosecutions that have been undertaken are all to the good. Grateful to the Justice Department for pursuing the wrongdoers who are trying to shed American blood on American soil. But we have to do more than that. That doesn't mean, as I said in my opening remarks, bombing Tehran, but the United States needs to actively deter Iran, demonstrate strength to the Iranian regime so that the regime concludes we have more to lose from carrying out these sorts of operations than we have to gain from them.
Mr. Greenway, what's your opinion on that?
I would agree completely. I think in the end, a bus is easier to stop before it gets to full speed. We were complacent before 9/11, and I think we can be accused of being complacent now. The threat is real, it is present, and it requires immediate action and priority. I think we have deprioritized the range of Iranian threats associated with the current administration's policies. If they're corrected, we may be able to detect the next threat before it occurs.
Mr. Warwick?
Well, this echoes debates that I've had with Mr. Greenway and Mr. Sales both. Iran did not go to our military academies and actually doesn't respond to deterrence in the way we teach it to our military. Strong defenses are the best way to prevent Iranian threats from harming us. We need to elevate our defenses here at home and to take out measures that will deter Iran's proxies from getting involved in these matters. But strong defenses at home are the absolute essential best way to defeat Iranian threats to the homeland. That includes in cybersecurity. It includes being aware of Iranian disinformation efforts, especially during our political campaigns. But they will stop at nothing in order to try to continue to extend their authority over the Middle East. And this obviously is a direct threat to Israel and to our Arab partners.
Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the ranking member for his questions, and I now recognize the vice chairman of the committee, the gentleman from Mississippi, also from Mississippi, Mr. Guest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To each of our witnesses, I want to thank you for referencing the October 7th attack on Israel by Hamas, a terrorist organization funded by Iran. Mr. Warwick, you say in your written statement that the Hamas terrorist attack on October 7th ranks among the worst terrorist attack in modern history. Mr. Greenway, you reference the attack, and you say at least 1,200 Israelis were killed, 2,200 wounded, and approximately 150 hostages taken as Hamas terrorists carried out an unprecedented multi-front attack on Israel at daybreak on October the 7th. And Ambassador Sales, in your written testimony, you state that this hearing is taking place in the aftermath of a horrific terrorist attack on our ally Israel. On October 7th, gunmen from Hamas, a Palestinian terrorist group, that the Islamic Republic provides with money, weapons, and training, invaded southern Israel from the Gaza Strip. More than 1,400 men, women, and children were mercilessly slaughtered, and 200 hostages were carried off into captivity, including infants and toddlers. You go on to say that October 7th was the deadliest day in Israel's 75 history, more than it was the deadliest day of Jews since the Holocaust. And finally, you referenced it was also a dark day for America, with 30 U.S. citizens killed and an estimated 1,300 missing. I want to take a minute first to condemn the attacks on Israel. I also want to take a moment to condemn members of Congress who do not support Israel's right to defend themselves, to defend members of Congress who spread false information that the hospital destroyed in Gaza was caused by Israel, when instead we know that our intelligence community shows that that destruction was caused by Palestinian militants. We know Iran is an exporter of terrorists, funding terrorist organizations such as Hamas and Hezbollah. We also know how Iran feels about America, that the Iranian regime hates America. Iranian leaders referred to America as the Great Satan. We saw several years ago after the death of General Soleimani that the Iranian parliament in unison chanted death to America, death to America. We also know that our intelligence agency has identified threats posed to the U.S. by Iran. In the annual threat assessment, which was conducted and put out by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, dated February of this year, there's an entire section on Iran. One of that section states Iran will continue to threaten U.S. persons directly and via proxy attacks, particularly in the Middle East. Iran also remains committed to developing surrogate networks inside the United States, an objective it has pursued for more than a decade. So in light of the warnings issued by the Director of National Intelligence, I want to speak to the threats to our homeland posed by the vulnerabilities caused by our unsecured border. We saw statistics that have recently been released. Shows a record number of immigrants coming across the border. Fiscal year 21, 1.7 million. FY 22, 2.4. This past year, FY 23, almost 2.5. And that's in addition to the estimated 1.5 million gotaways. We know that Fox reported that this month that there were 2 Iranians who were apprehended crossing the southwest border, both who appeared on the terrorist screening database. Mr. Greenway, in the brief amount of time that I have left, I would ask that you would speak specifically to the dangers posed to our homeland by this administration's failure to secure our southwest border.
Thank you, Congressman. I would say that first, you correctly point out that the population that's entered our border provides rich potential for them to recruit criminal organizations to conduct a range of attacks. Second, their operational infrastructure already here in the United States has been deprioritized such that it has been unaddressed. The combination of the two constitute a present risk.
And one last thing, Mr. Greenway, and then I'll close. One of your recommendations is to enact H.R. 2 and to reestablish territorial integrity. Is that correct?
It is, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Carter.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Jewish religious institutions, including schools and synagogues, have seen an uptick in threats since the Hamas terrorist attack on Israel, including places like New Orleans, which I represent. The New Orleans Police Department has had to boost security around the Jewish community, and according to Interim Police Chief Superintendent Ann Kirkpatrick, New Orleans Police has deployed directed patrols to ensure the safety of our Jewish institutions and communities. Similarly, we have seen an uptick in anti-Muslim threats across the country, including the tragic murder of a 6-year-old Palestinian boy in Illinois by a deranged man who was driven to kill after becoming enraged while listening to conservative talk radio. Mr. Warwick, based on your experience, how do events unfolding in Israel and in Gaza and the way news and politicians talk about these events affect Homeland Security and the threats minority communities face, and what steps should government take to ensure the safety of minority and religious institutions?
Thank you very much for that question. I completely agree with the proposition that it is important for all of our leaders to speak out against anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Americans have the tradition of expressing differences through peaceful means, but it's absolutely unacceptable when language becomes so inflamed that it encourages what are often lone actors who read these messages, consume this content to believe that they should somehow carry out acts of violence. It is deeply, deeply troubling when leaders call for violence or for measures that any reasonable person would understand would cause those who are in some ways close to the edge to go over that edge into violent actions. So the best thing that all of our leaders can do is continue to call for everyone to resist anti-Semitism, resist Islamophobia, and remember that as Americans, we settle our differences through democratic and peaceful means.
Thank you. Iran has a long history of assassination plots and targeting dissidents who live outside the country. One of our witnesses here today has been the target of a plot to kidnap her and another plot to assassinate her. We know the indictments that Iran has plotted to assassinate high-level former U.S. officials, including former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Mr. Warwick, what specific U.S. counterterrorism assets or capabilities are most critical to our goal in disrupting the countering these and other threats from Iran?
I want to salute the work of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which has the lead for investigating these types of threats against the American people. The FBI has done some extraordinary work, some of which I've seen firsthand in its ability to do so. That having been said, as Ms. Alanijad said, there are limits to what the FBI is able to do, and it's clear that there do need to be additional measures taken to find ways to protect former U.S. officials and American citizens who may be threatened by outrageous actions of the Iranian regime.
For each member, very quickly, you're sitting before the Homeland Security Committee, a committee of bipartisan members with the desire to weigh in, to help. Given that you now have this audience, can you each very briefly tell us what can we do if you had one opportunity to ask this committee to weigh in and to help? What might that ask be? Starting with you, sir.
Thank you, Congressman. I would say secure the border. Provide the authorities and resources necessary to secure the border. Thank you.
Add something. America needs to have a bipartisan strategy towards transnational repression. This is very serious that I'm not alone. I see that a lot of activists and dissidents from other countries being the target of transnational repression on U.S. soil. And we see that how Iranian, like the regime in Iran, is the alliance of dictators, autocrats, from Russia to China to Islamic Republic. They're all helping each other, backing each other, supporting each other, but we don't see alliance of democratic countries supporting each other. Like IRGC is in the terrorist list by the United States of America, but the U.S. must take lead and ask its allies to designate and criminalize IRGC as a terrorist organization as well, which we don't see that. And I kept hearing from the lawmakers from the United Kingdom saying that actually this is the U.S. advising them not to lose the embassy because they have to have a channel open towards this terrorist regime in Iran.
I would echo Ambassador Sales' recommendation and add to reprioritize Palestinian terrorist groups and Iranian surrogates in the United States and abroad.
And I would say bipartisanship, cybersecurity, especially the private sector, reauthorize the WMD office at DHS, renew 702, keep INA able to do some collection with constitutional protections, extend authorities to counter unmanned aerial systems, reauthorize CFATS, and reauthorize Section 702 with the changes that Mr. Greenway and I agreed should be looked at.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina and the chairman of the Subcommittee on Oversight, Committee on Homeland Security, Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Two of the most stunning moments I've had sitting on any committee in Congress are in November of last year when I asked Christine Abizaid, the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, whether the uncontrolled entry into the country of, I guess it's in excess of 1.7 million, if I remember, was the number that Judiciary Committee recently documented in a report of gotaways. That is to say, people who never encountered anyone from any United States agency as they entered the country, was not an obvious risk for egregious risk for criminal or or terrorist threats on the homeland. I want to know if anybody on Ms. Abizaid told me it's not. That they don't believe that's it, because historically that's not how terrorist threats have developed in the homeland. That seems to me to be unimaginably stupid. And today we've heard members on the dais essentially repeat that is an unfair attack on the Biden administration. I'd like to know if anybody sitting on the panel believes that allowing 1.7 million into the country during the Biden administration without any vetting of any kind, no connection to or encounter of any government official, presents an egregious threat of terrorism to the homeland. Does anyone disbelieve that who sits on this panel? Thank you. Is it a threat to the United States homeland if there is an Iranian government influence operation functioning at the highest levels of the United States administration? Does anyone on the panel believe that that would not present a threat to the homeland? Is anyone on the panel familiar with this reporting in Semaphore that there was this Iran experts initiative operated by the Iranian government that had contact not with only Robert Malley, the Biden administration's special envoy, who's now, I understand, suspended, but I can't figure out this one. There's a woman named, I think, Ariane Tabatabai, if that's how you pronounce it. Ms. Alenajad, perhaps you could correct me if that's the wrong pronunciation, but she's the chief of staff to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations, a classified operation, a classified position. Has to have a security clearance to be in that position, obviously. And there's documentation of her 2014 email correspondence with Zafari, is that the name? Zorani, I believe it is, who's adjacent to the Iranian Foreign Ministry. This is in the Biden administration. As far as I know, she's still there, and I don't even hear any major mainstream reporting on that. Is there anyone on this panel that can enlighten the American people in this hearing about the details of that situation? Ms. Alenajad.
It was shocking for you, but not for us Iranians. I was the one actually launched a petition against Rob Malley right after the brutal murder of Mahsa Amini, because he was the one actually came out and saying that Iranian people want respect from its government. But that was not the fact. Iranian people sacrificed their life. More than 700 people got killed. More than 22,000 people got arrested. They had only one demand. They wanted to end this regime. They don't want respect from this government. After 40 years, we, the people of Iran, know that this regime is not reformable. Whether you like it or not, we want to have a regime change. But Rob Malley actually stopped the Biden administration to meet with people like me and other Iranian Americans who say clearly we want an end for gender apartheid regime. So that's why he had like his own people trying to say that, protests, like Ariane Tabatabai was one of them, saying that it's became part of the culture of Iranians. It's not. So that is why we've been warning the US government and we've been ignored. But that's information launched by Iran International and Semaphore is correct.
Oh, thank you.
They were the same people trying to say that Qasem Soleimani was a national hero. Here we are.
Thank you. And in
was
the
a
last
gift.
25 seconds I've got, I want to make one last comment. I'm sorry Mr. Magaziner has left, Mr. Chairman. But in the beginning of this, when he was talking about the vicious, horrific anti-Semitism that we've seen in this country, he repeated a smear of the former president. Whatever you think about the former president, I'd urge you to go to USA Today about that continued claim that he said that anti-Semites, that neo-Nazis were fine people on both sides. It is a lie. It is a gutter lie. And you cannot maintain bipartisan support for rejecting anti-Semitism in this country when you equate saying that, when he went on to say, I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis. They should be condemned entirely. He was talking about people who were protesting the removal of a Confederate statue in the previous events to that Charlottesville event. And for that to be repeated over and over again by members on this dais, when even liberal organizations recognize that that is a smear, that's got to stop in order for this bipartisan rejection of anti-Semitism to succeed. I yield.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Ivey. I believe Maryland, right?
Still, yes, Your
Still
yes,
Maryland.
Mr. Chairman,
right?
that's correct.
For his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to hear from this panel. I think I want to thank the chairman for bringing this together. We don't all agree on some of the things that have been said and some of the points of emphasis. Before he leaves, though, I did want to thank Chairman Bishop for his work on some related issues. We had a previous subcommittee hearing on domestic terrorism threats. Now, we came at it from different angles. You know, you focused on the issues from the left, I focused on the issues from the right. But I think it's still important that we recognize that those issues are there, because it's been pointed out by the panel, and I'll come back to the border wall issue in a moment, but you know, one of the things I think we need to focus on with respect to threats from Iran are the domestic opportunities that they have. We already know that, as we've heard from some of our leaders in law enforcement at the federal level, domestic terrorism is one of the top challenges, if not the top challenge in the United States with respect to overall terrorism. We've had hearings here in this committee. I'm on judiciary as well with respect to lone wolf killings and attacks on democracy. I want to make sure that we focus on these issues because with respect to the threat, CISA, one of the agencies within the Homeland Security Department, has really been undermined, frankly, by some of the leadership. Some of my colleagues on the Judiciary Committee, including the chairman, have taken opportunities to really challenge that entity. And so the ability for us to, as a government, to respond to interaction from Iran that's attempting to undermine the nation with respect to democracy or ginning up false information has been a problem. I think we need to reinvigorate that, and I hope that we can do that as well with this group. I see Congressman Pfluger's returned. I did want to take a moment and apologize for interrupting your opening statement. I didn't realize the context of what was going on with that. With respect to the border wall, I do want to say this too. I had a chance to go to Israel last month, actually, with Congressman Carter and some others. And we went down to the Gaza border and saw that, I think pretty much some of the same areas that we saw Hamas coming across. I know in H.R. 2, the border wall is a key focus. I know there's a strong interest by my Republican colleagues in completing that. In fact, H.R. 2 has a mandate for 900 additional miles of border wall to be built up. I still continue to believe that that's not the right way to go. I think the additional funds that could be used, our calculation was that 900 miles of additional wall would run about $18 billion. The supplemental that the White House sent, which I would encourage my colleagues to support, I think is less than that total amount. And so I think we need to move forward with the supplemental proposal with respect to 1,600 new asylum officers, 375 new immigration judges. I think this can also help with getting a control over the number of people who are in the United States. We talk a lot about the people who come across the border and we don't know their backgrounds, and or where they are. I think if we expand the personnel who can deal with that, I think that would be a big step in the right direction. I know there's going to be an issue and discussion in Israel about what happened at the border. I don't want to get into that now. I think it's important to simply support them in their efforts to defeat Hamas and dismantle Hamas. But I think there is some instruction there for the United States as we consider H.R. 2 and the border wall. I think in closing, I wanted to ask a quick question to the ambassador. You said kind of in two ways that we needed to do more. I think at one point you said more than a press release with respect to the deterrence. And then with respect to questions from the ranking member, you mentioned that we've already had prosecutions and that you can congratulate the Department of Justice on that. But I want to get a sense of specific steps. What specifically would you be saying we should do? You said don't bomb Tehran, and I appreciate that comment. But what exactly did you have in mind that we should be doing?
Well, Congressman, thanks for the question. It's actually really hard to answer that from the chair I'm currently sitting in as a private citizen without access to classified intelligence reporting and not being privy to diplomatic conversations in the region. So I think the best I can do from my current perch is to offer a sort of broad strategic advice. And that strategic advice is impose costs using whatever tools of national power are available. Economic power, diplomatic power, law enforcement power, intelligence, perhaps military under the right circumstances. Use whatever levers of national power are available to us to impose costs.
Let me reclaim my time briefly, and before I wrap up, we've heard a lot of comments about appeasement. Again, I would encourage my colleagues with respect to Ukraine and the funding for them. If we don't want to send a message about appeasement that's interpreted the wrong way, I think it's critical for us to continue to fund Ukraine. And I yield back.
Thank you. This time the chair recognizes Mr. Jimenez for 5 minutes for his questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ms. Salinajad, I think that the people of Iran and the people of my home country of Cuba, when they go out and they protest on the street, they probably say the same thing, maybe a different language. People of Cuba say freedom. Is that what the people of Iran say? Exactly. All right. Everybody seeks the same thing. It's freedom. All these apologists that know they want food or they want this or they want a little bit kinder regime. We want regime change because that's the only thing that will help us. Exactly. As far as the border wall is concerned and security at I may have a difference of opinion with my colleagues. I actually don't think any funding helps whatsoever. We can put $1 zillion into the southern border and nothing will change because the policies won't change. It's the policies that have caused the crisis at the border, the policies of this administration. There wasn't any difference in funding from January 19th to January 21 of 2021. It was the change in policies that have caused the crisis at the border. There wasn't any more wall. It's the change in policy. And this administration has absolutely, they have no will to change their policy. They like what's going on. You can't be this dumb. It's on purpose. Now let's get back to something else. Hey, do you know what cybersecurity, rockets, drones, rifles, bullets, paragliders, anti-tank missiles, terror cells, spies, misinformation campaigns, a whole bunch of different other things. You know what they have in common? Funding, money. So, Mr. Greenway, I want you to talk to me about how the Biden administration is helping Iran get more of the funding that it needs to conduct its terror operations around the world, including the United States. And the difference between this administration and what was happening in the previous administration and how that's pouring billions of dollars into this regime that's funding all the terror and the chaos we see around the world. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Thanks for the question, Congressman. I can. At the conclusion of the Trump administration, as Ambassador Sales pointed out, Iran's foreign accessible reserves were at $4 billion, which was the equivalent of Haiti. They were exporting about 400,000 barrels of oil a month, which is what you can do under smuggling circumstances and with little else. They were committed to acquiring resources rather than the conduct of terrorist organizations and terrorist activity. At the moment, their accessible foreign exchange reserves are north of $40 billion, on their way to $70 billion. Their oil sales are approaching 2 million barrels a day. And it's important to note that oil is now north of $90 a barrel. So they're making more and selling more. This has all breathed life into the organization. The defense budget has increased by 14%. That's just what goes to the IRGC itself. And all of that goes then to surrogates and proxies who now are no longer worried about resources. They have flush amount of resources and capital. They're now able to focus their time and activity on terrorist harbors.
So by my calculation, that's a 500% increase in oil production, or actually the selling of oil, Iranian oil, 500% increase, plus the increase in the oil prices. A lot of it's caused by this administration because they refuse to let American energy produce more oil and gas, which actually makes Iranian oil much more expensive, which gives them more money to do the things that they do. So tell me, how serious is this administration, really, in helping our allies or helping the United States security when they're actually funding the same people that are trying to destroy us? By the way, does Iran want to destroy the United States? When the leaders say they want to destroy the United States, does anybody here think that's just, hey, they're just kidding? You know, do you think they're kidding?
They're not known for their sense of humor, Congressman.
Okay, what about you, ma'am?
I mean, absolutely, they are. They mean it, and they don't even care whether you're Republican or Democrats. They hate America, and they want to destroy America, democracy, Israel. That's why they hate people like me who say that, America, get ready to see an Iran without Islamic Republic. Because you don't have any policy to see that, that's why you stick with wrong people who say, let's reform this regime.
I need to get the other two. Do you believe that Iran wants to destroy the United States?
They do.
And Mr. Warwick, do you think they would want to destroy it?
Iran wants to dominate the Middle East, and they see the United States as the chief impediment to that goal.
Do they want to destroy us?
They know they can't destroy us.
Do they want to?
That's
There's the problem. See?
No.
Folks, there's a problem. Do you think they want to destroy Israel? Do you have any doubt they want to destroy Israel?
Oh, on that I agree with you.
Well, very good. So we agree on one thing, all four of us do. Okay, very good. And this administration is giving them the money to let them do it. Thank you. Now yield back.
The gentleman yields, and I know I've been very lenient on letting people go over, and I do my best to apply that bipartisanly. However, we've run the math, and we think there's a vote's going to be called at noon. So as I do the math, we want to make sure as many people get an opportunity to speak today. So I'm going to tighten up a little bit for everyone bipartisanly on our time limits. And I apologize, that leniency I normally have has to go away. Mr. Goldman is recognized, a gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr.
Actually, you snuck in on me, Doctor. Mr. Tanadar will be recognized. We'll get to you.
Thank you, Chair, and I'll be quick. I think I'm going to skip some of my introduction here and go right into my questions. Mr. Warwick, what unique challenges does Iran's use of proxy hackers like Hezbollah pose to the defending U.S. interest in cyberspace related to both domestic networks and those of our allies? What do you see as the biggest threat posed by increasingly capable cyber actors associated with terrorist organizations like Hezbollah? To what degree do the cyber capabilities of Hamas and Hezbollah pose a threat to the homeland, and are we prepared?
So Iran's cyber threats are most posed by contractors who are based in Iran and who think that by attacking the United States, they will be rewarded with additional contracts and other kinds of benefits that they want to receive. Hezbollah, Hamas, and others have very active disinformation networks, and it's actually that concerns me. The propaganda that those groups put out is intended to inflame the situation in the Middle East and to try to encourage people here in the United States, which I have to say, I must remind everyone, they target people who are already U.S. citizens or who are already here with this propaganda, and this really concerns me.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Warwick. And in the wake of October 7th attacks, questions have arisen about the intelligence shortfall regarding Hamas's plan to carry out a terrorist attack. There have been questions about the U.S. intelligence community's awareness. As media has reported, the U.S. warned about a potential escalation in violence, but did not predict the complex, multi-pronged attack by Hamas. Mr. Wark, how can we, Congress, assist to strengthen or provide resources that monitor and predict these attacks, especially predict the magnitude of this attack?
So it's obvious that within Israel, after the war is over, there will be a reckoning on and an attempt to find lessons learned. I would hope that this Congress would do the same thing here in the United States so that there can be an independent bipartisan inquiry into what went wrong. I do have to say, though, that the United States relies very heavily on our intelligence partnerships. We don't try to do everything ourselves. That would be wasteful, inefficient, and probably just plain wrong. And so in this case, we do rely on allies, including Israel, but not only Israel, to increase what we know about these threats. I think there's an essential role for the Congress to play in a serious lessons learned exercise so that a strategic surprise like this doesn't happen to us. The Iranian regime is capable of doing that, as we have seen, and this very much concerns me.
Thank you. And Chair, I yield back a few minutes here.
Thank you, sir. I now recognize Mr. Pfluger from Texas for his 5 minutes.
And Mr. Chairman, can I take just 20 seconds personal privilege?
Sure. I mean, it's your time anyway. Yeah.
I've spoken with Mr. Ivey, and we had a good conversation, and my apologies for some of the unnecessary commentary earlier. We were able to talk about that. This is a committee that needs to function bipartisanly. Anyways, as we get to the, I hope you'll accept that apology as well.
Certainly, Congressman. Thank you. I appreciate it.
You know, look, we've got 1.7 million known gotaways since President Biden took office. Ambassador Sales mentioned the number of Iranians, Syrians, Iraqis, Lebanese, Yemenis. It's 650 Iranians that have come into the country that we know about. 7.5 million people total in that period of time. When you look at what happened in Israel and you compare the threat, the possibility of a threat, Ambassador Sales, what lessons do we learn, and what actions must the Biden administration immediately take to prevent that type of attack from happening here?
Well, Congressman, I think one of the lessons from October 7th is that vigilance is essential. We can't let up on our guard. We have to take our adversaries seriously. When they say that they want to kill Americans, we have to believe them, and we have to prepare so that we can prevent them from doing so. When they say they want to wipe Israel off the face of the map, that's not just rhetoric. When they say death to America, that means death to Americans. And it's not just rhetoric, that's their goal. We have to take that seriously, we have to prepare, and we have to prevent it.
When it comes to our policy towards Iran, give me 2 or 3 points that need to be immediately reversed from this administration.
I think the most important thing that we can do, Congressman, is cut off the flow of money to Iran. You've heard some numbers from me, you've heard some numbers from Mr. Greenway. The bottom line is that sanctions work. Sanctions deprive terrorists and their state sponsors of the resources that they use to shed blood around the world. During the last administration, when we squeezed Iran's economy to the point that its accessible foreign currency reserves were equivalent to Haiti, the money for terrorism dried up. Both Hamas and Hezbollah had to adopt austerity programs to deal with the shortfall. And as I mentioned, Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, had to go on TV and beg for donations. That is the sort of sanctions posture we need to get back to dry up the resources for these groups.
Ms. Alinejad, thank you for your testimony, and thank you for reminding us that the Iranian people are not the problem, that the issue is the Iranian government, that the despotism, the authoritarianism, and the horrific ways in which Iranian people are treated is reflective of their desire to do harm and to use terror as the largest state sponsor of terror around the world, and I appreciate that. I'm going to move on to Mr. Greenway because I want to get to something that you talked about. What Ambassador Sales was talking about on the sanctions. Talk to us about what this administration has done, how that's viewed as appeasement, or if it's something else, please tell us. But what has the issuance of waivers on some of the money, let's just first look at the $6 billion in Qatar right now. It's not been given to the Iranian government, but it's made available. And talk to us about that and the need for sanctions as it's viewed around the world as strength instead of weakness and appeasement.
Appreciate the question, Congressman. And as Ambassador Sales pointed out, the interpretation that Iran has made is that their behavior, their conduct is encouraged because they're being rewarded for it. And that is the interpretation of all of our partners and allies in the region and those that we would target with sanctions in order to change their behavior. The interpretation is that we are getting the behavior that we are paying for. Our allies in the region think that we're paying for Iran's nuclear program because essentially we are. And all of this does is encourage Iran to conduct more of the behavior and provides the resources, the capital necessary to do it at levels it has not seen in over 20 years.
Is there any doubt in any of y'all's minds, I'll start with Ambassador Sales and go down the list, that Iran would use our porous southern border to infiltrate and then carry out an attack in the United States? Is there any doubt that they would not do that?
Zero doubt. They've tried to do it before. They'll try to do it again.
Ms. Linajad?
Sorry. Iranian regime claimed that the money that they get from the US government, it goes for humanitarian purpose. I am here to tell you that for the Islamic Republic, wiping out Israel from the map, destroying Israel, destroying America is a humanitarian act. That's why we asked the US government to stop handing out this money to Iranian regime, because it goes to Hamas and Hezbollah.
My time has expired. Any doubt, Mr. Greenway, Mr. Warwick, that they would use that to attack us?
None whatsoever, sir.
I have to get a yes or no.
It's much more complicated than that. And
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Goldman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'm heartened that there's so much bipartisan agreement about the threat that Iran poses not only in the Middle East, but to the United States, and I do hope that we can continue to work together. Some of the rhetoric, though, coming from my colleagues across the aisle is a little disconcerting, I must say. My distinguished colleague from Florida tried to say that the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally was not anti-Semitic and filled with neo-Nazis using anti-Semitic slogans. The demonstrators chanted lines like, quote, "Jews will not replace us." They used slogans like blood and soil, which is a phrase drawn from Nazi ideology. One said, "This city is run by Jewish communists and criminal N-word." I will not say that. That was an anti-Semitic neo-Nazi rally that President Trump said there were good people on both sides. So let's not dispute the facts. Second, I want to point out in response I'm sorry, that was Mr. Bishop who said that. Mr. Jimenez was talking about how the issues we have on our border are purely policy issues. They are not funding issues. And that the Biden administration has done nothing to address policy. That is false. The problem the Biden administration has is that every policy change they make is subject to a lawsuit by Republicans. So the Republicans are trying to sabotage the Biden administration's efforts to fix the issues at the border and then bash the administration while they are doing that. That is not helpful. But what is, I think, helpful is what Ambassador Sales said, which when asked, and correct me if I'm wrong, when asked what the most important thing that the government can do, the Biden administration can do to stop the criminal organizations on the border was more funding. Is that right?
Funding and authority, sir.
Funding, okay. Well, It's interesting because in the supplemental recommendation by the administration, they include money to hire 1,000 additional CBP officers and resources for Homeland Security Investigations, HSI. That would be funding to combat transnational criminal organizations. Is that right, Ambassador Sales?
Having not reviewed the legislation, I'm reluctant to offer a view on it, but...
Well, you would agree that 1,000 more officers and additional resources for the investigative arm of the Department of Homeland Security would be new funding and helpful to combat transnational criminal organizations on the border. Are you going to disagree with that?
That is certainly new funding, and I would also want them to have the full authorities to make use of those resources.
Right. So I understand, and I'm just quoting back what you said. It also asks for an additional 1,300 Border Patrol agents to work alongside the 20,000 agents that were funded in their fiscal year 2024 budget. There are also support for 300 new Border Patrol processing coordinators so that the Border Patrol agents can focus on their critical national security mission. The list goes on. The problem we have here is there are policies in place. The administration is trying to put more money in order to combat the transnational criminal organizations and the Mexican drug cartels. And my Republican colleagues oppose that. In fact, some of my Republican colleagues want to defund the FBI. Mr. Warwick, would defunding the FBI help combat transnational criminal organizations such as the cartels and the fentanyl problem that we have?
It would be a disaster of unimaginable proportions to defund the FBI.
It would. And I think it's important as we are attacking not only the terrorism exported by Iran around the world and our southern border, that we try to unify, as we have in our support for Israel, as we have in denouncing terrorism and Hamas, but also as we try to address the issues at the southern border. And instead, my Republican colleagues want to politicize this issue for their own benefit, and that is not constructive. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I do want to make a point, though, of clarification. There was significant new funding in H.R. 2 to include increasing the size of Border Patrol over a set number of years in excess of what was requested by the White House, increased technology license plate readers. So I will correct the gentleman on that.
So I hope you'll agree with the supplemental.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Sales, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence's 2023 annual threat assessment states that Iran remains a major cyber threat. Iran's growing expertise and willingness to conduct aggressive cyber operations make it a major threat to the security of the U.S. and allied networks and data. Iran's opportunistic approach to cyber attacks make critical infrastructure owners in the United States susceptible to being targeted. Ambassador, in your role as coordinator for counterterrorism, you were able to witness firsthand the capabilities of our enemies to conduct terror attacks on our critical infrastructure. In your experience, how has Iran used cyber to enable their operations?
Well, Congressman, thanks for the question. I think Iran is a very capable adversary, and we spoke previously about America playing to its strengths and using the tools of national power available to us. That's exactly what Iran does as well. It wants to operate below the threshold of open conflict with the United States because it knows that it doesn't stand a chance. Ronald Reagan sank half the Iranian Navy in the 1980s, and they learned a lesson from that. So instead of risking open conflict, they use proxies, such as Hezbollah, such as Hamas, to carry out a terrorist agenda. They use cyber intrusions to target critical infrastructure in the United States. Not the sort of thing that would trigger open conflict with the United States, but that would be an irritant and then some, and that would disable critical U.S. capabilities. That's their tradecraft, to operate below the threshold. It's an instinct for self-preservation that is largely driving this, I think.
So the threshold, in your opinion, is just more of a not an annoyance, but, just to keep peppering us and our allies with minor attacks?
Well, I wouldn't consider many of the Iranian intrusions into our networks minor. I would consider them to be potentially quite significant. They may not be turned on today, but inserting malware into our systems that can then be activated in the event of some inflection point being reached, something that could disable the grid, something that could take hospitals offline. That would not be a minor attack in anybody's estimation, even if we haven't seen the consequences today.
I see a couple of the other witnesses nodding their heads, so I'll open it up to hear your responses as well. Mr. Warwick?
Yes, it really does concern me that Iran keeps getting better and better in its cyber attacks. The first few attacks were nuisance attacks against small dams that had no strategic significance. They've gotten better, and so our defenses need to get better as well.
Yes, Mr. Green. We'll just go down the list.
Iranian regime, they're really good at rallying their cyber army against not only Iranian dissidents and activists, they interfered in the election in the United States of America. That should be taken serious. And more than this, when they want to kill someone, they want to assassinate someone, some activists and dissidents, first they go after him or her through cyber army on social media. Well, how ironic that the Iranian regime are using US tech companies to bully their oppositions, but at the same time, they ban 18 million people from using social media. The US government must do something to kick out the dictators because they're using the social media for their cyber army and rallying, mobilizing extremists against Israeli dissidents, against US dissidents, and Iranian Americans as well.
Thank you.
As long as they're rewarded for their conduct and they pay no price for it, it will continue and it will get worse. That has been the pattern since 1979, and that will continue to be the pattern.
Thank you. I have about a minute left, so I do want to focus on Iran's use of technology. Ambassador, I'm concerned about the ramifications of the accessible AI tools to improve our adversaries' cyber capabilities. What should we be most concerned about regarding Iran's use of AI?
Well, I think something that Ms. Linajad just said is exactly right. The Iranian regime wants to take advantage of technologies and capabilities pioneered by innovators in the United States and use it to shore up the regime's survivability. The irony, the supreme leader is on Twitter every day saying death to America, death to Jews, death to Israel. And he denies his own people the ability to access the internet, the ability to use Twitter, the ability to get information unfiltered through, the regime's censors. So, we need to be very clear about, this is a big conversation, probably enough for a separate hearing. We need to be very clear about the rules of the road so that American tech companies, so that other American private sector actors are not unwittingly enabling bad behavior by the regime.
Thank you. I'm out of time, so I yield back, but I agree with you. This could be a hearing all its own. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Magaziner.
Thank you, Chairman. There's a lot that needs to be dealt with in order to defend and stand with our ally Israel, to deal with the humanitarian situation in Gaza, and to protect Americans here at home. But one aspect that I want to focus on as ranking member for counterterrorism and intelligence, there was a massive intelligence failure in the lead up to Hamas's attack on Israel. Israeli intelligence, which has a reputation of being amongst the best in the world, seemed to be blindsided by the scale of the attack that unfolded. U.S. intelligence, which I understand relies heavily on Israeli intelligence when it comes to monitoring Hamas, also was caught unaware. And we as a Congress have a responsibility to make sure that that kind of intelligence failure does not happen again. And in particular, this committee has a responsibility to make sure that such an intelligence failure cannot exist here in the U.S. homeland. So, Mr. Warwick, I'd like to ask you to expand on your remarks a little bit. What tools does Congress need to provide with the appropriate civil liberties protections in place to ensure that the intelligence community does not fail to detect a massive attack on the U.S. homeland the same way that they apparently failed to detect the plot against Israel?
The most important thing would be to renew Section 702 authorization that would allow the collection of certain kinds of signals intelligence by foreign adversaries. As several of us have said here, this is extremely vital. There do need to be safeguards built in, but the program as a whole needs to be renewed with those safeguards. Second, it concerns me that there's a bill, language from the Senate that would take away DHS intelligence analysis's ability to do certain kinds of collections. Again, there need to be constitutional protections in place. We should all agree on that. There should be investigations as the House language calls, but I would hope that the House, in this particular provision, stands by its guns during the conference that's now underway. Additionally, there are other authorizations that just absolutely have to be extended. The CWMD office, the counter-UAS authorities, and the CFAT's reauthorization are all vital to our homeland security.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask about Iran's cyber attacks as well. Mr. Garbarino touched on that, so I won't repeat his question. But Mr. Warwick, in addition to the attacks that Iran has conducted against infrastructure in the United States, even a hospital in Boston, you note in your written testimony that they have also attempted to engage in disinformation campaigns in increasing levels of sophistication. Can you expand on that a bit and talk about what we as a Congress might do to combat Iranian disinformation efforts online?
So in a recent election a couple of years ago, Iran carried out a campaign to try to stoke racial division and hatred within the United States by spreading false information. That was frankly a more sophisticated attack than some people might have given the Iranians credit for. One of the things that I've learned in more than 40 years is these guys get better every time, and so our defenses have to get better every time. We're going to have to be better prepared to resist Iranian disinformation in the next election because otherwise they could surprise us.
Thank you very much. And, you know, I'll just say I had to step out for a moment to take a call, but I'm told that a member from the other side, Mr. Bishop, took it upon himself to try to educate me about anti-Semitism. I'll just say again that when you show up at a rally and there are people chanting, "Jews will not replace us," blood and soil, carrying torches, if you're a fine person, you leave. You get out of there. You do not stay. You do not support that. And a strong leader in the President of the United States or a member of Congress would condemn it in no uncertain terms, not say, find people on both sides. And with that, I'll yield. Thank you.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize another gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Ezell, for his questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today and sharing with us this very important topic that we are discussing. I want to begin today by saying how important it is that we stand with Israel during the recent attacks, and we must hold Hamas and their supporters, such as Iran, accountable for these terrible actions. We know that Iran supports terrorists around the world, organizations, they finance terrorism. I find it very concerning that recent reports suggest a former Biden administration official, Robert Malley, used the State Department to funnel billions of dollars to Iran. And as we've heard today, they don't mean to do good things to America or Israel. This continues to threaten all of our allies around the world. And each day we see with all the things that are going on, it's getting closer and closer to the U.S. Mr. Sales, while there are many questions that we must answer involving Robert Malley, still, do you believe the actions by the Biden administration have emboldened Iran and encouraged the terrorists around the attack on Israel?
Well, Congressman, I think the best way to answer that is to look at Iran's behavior. And what we have seen from Iran over the past several years has been a dramatic increase in its confrontation of the United States and of our allies in the region. You know, just within the past 7 days or more. We've seen, I think, 13 separate attacks on American soldiers in the Middle East by Iran-backed proxies in places like Syria, in places like Iraq, even off the coast of Yemen. I think the Iranian regime is like a spoiled child. It will act out until a parent steps in and puts them in the naughty corner. And what we need to see from the administration is the application of pressure to the regime to impose costs on them to reestablish deterrence.
Thank you very much. Ms. Alinejad, excuse me for my southern voice here, but I want you to tell us a little bit today about your experience because the Biden administration and what you went through in your life and your family. I would like for you to give us some details today about how that made you feel and about how they responded to helping you during this crisis.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity, actually sharing my experience with President Biden. To be honest, very heartbroken, very disappointed, because I believe that Democrats are all about equality, feminism, women's rights. And I'm being the target of the Islamic Republic just because of giving voice to voiceless women, to brave leaders within the country saying, we want to end gender apartheid regime. Mm-hmm. I wanted to meet with President Biden because when I came in America, I actually watched a video clip of him, very vocal and loud, saying that let's ban South Africa because of apartheid. And I was like, okay, he is the man. He can understand that why we, the women of Iran, are fighting against gender apartheid. But unfortunately, when the FBI stopped the kidnapping plot, I just received a letter from President Biden calling me a hero, thanking me, and I was like, hey, I'm here. I'm in America. I want to meet you. Don't do anything when I got killed. So no answer. Then the FBI arrested a man with loaded gun in front of my house. So I believe that if Biden administration was tough on terror, if they were condemning and taking actions, they wouldn't have come after me on U.S. soil. Like, there was a big, gigantic guy in front of my house. He didn't even need to carry a gun, honestly. He could have just killed me easily. So still, I'm very surprised that the vice president, a woman, this is a dream for Iranian women. We receive award from the West, but we don't see actions. We don't see that concrete action. They're always saying that we stand with the people of Iran. And I always say that I want you to sit down with us and make decision about how to end this gender apartheid regime. Because an Iran without barbaric regime would benefit the US, would benefit the democratic countries. Believe me, the women are better allies for the US government compared to these barbaric mullahs. So I want the Biden administration, first, to meet with people like us. Don't be scared. And second, support the women inside Iran who say no to Islamic Republic. Instead of negotiating with these killers, recognize the civil society and help us, not our killers.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Ramirez, for her 5 minutes questioning.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate it. And thank you to the witnesses that are here today. You know, after numerous consecutive hearings related only to how we criminalize immigrants on the border, I'm really glad that our committee is ready to discuss other threats to our national security. I agree that Iran represents a real threat to our national security, and I fully believe it's our responsibility as members of Congress and members of this committee to address it with the intentionality, the seriousness and merits, and that we avoid political games to score political points. Mr. Warrick, earlier question was put to the panel regarding Iran and the southwestern border, and you were cut off before you were allowed to answer. So I'm going to give you about 30 seconds of my time if you briefly want to share your response with the committee now.
In every one of the known plots that has been made public, Iran has targeted for recruitment people inside the United States, either people who were born here or people who had come here who were not terrorists when they came here. And many of those have obviously refused to cooperate. The other part of the reality is, although Mexican drug cartels frequently feature prominently in FBI charging documents of Iranian agents, it's almost always that they thought it was a good idea, and then it turned out, as in the Arbabsiar plot, that they were actually talking to a DEA source, or they were talking, in another case, to an FBI human source. It's quite fascinating. The Iranian regime has utterly failed to actually recruit drug cartels in any publicly available case that we've seen.
Thank you. Well, speaking of threats to citizens, I hope that I am speaking for everyone in this room when I say that the attack from Hamas on innocent Israeli civilians back on October 7th left us all heartbroken. It is unexcusable, and I unequivocally condemn Hamas attacks on Israel and the escalating violence that has followed, claiming the lives of more than 1,000 Palestinian children in Gaza. I also join my colleagues in calling for the immediate release of all hostages and the safe return of all American citizens in the region, including, we don't talk enough about, the 500 Palestinian Americans that are in Gaza right now and can't get out. Folks, I'm really worried about the escalation of violence that can lead us as a country and the effect that it will have on our own national security. That is why I've called on my colleagues and the administration to use our collective power and urge for a ceasefire to help de-escalate the tensions in the region and allow for diplomacy to be leveraged to avoid a multi-front conflict. So with that in mind, Mr. Warwick, in your experience, what could we do to ensure protection of our own communities here at home, seeing a rise in hate crimes? And specifically, what could we do to de-escalate the violence in the Middle East?
So there's a whole discussion to be had about the importance of community-based programs to try to turn people away from violence. These programs have been successful. They need to be funded at scale. Even if it costs $10 billion to do so, we need to ensure our communities are safe and that people turn away from violence.
Thank you, Mr. Warwick. So I want to finish by reminding everyone on this committee that, and we say this on both sides, that words we use to address the threat to our nation do matter. They hold power. Our committee shouldn't be a stage to further promote language of violence and ideals like Islamophobia and anti-Semitism that endanger the communities we are here to protect. Close to 2 weeks ago, 30 minutes away from my district, a man fueled by the rising Islamophobia and hateful rhetoric being spewed about carelessly and recklessly, like what we have heard in this committee over and over again. This man stabbed this little boy whose birthday had just passed 26 times and attempted to murder his 32-year-old mother due to their Muslim religion and being Palestinian. A 6-year-old in his community is now deprived of his future. His death is also a failure of this committee. And in the name of Wadea Al-Fumayum and every single child and family put at risk by bigotry, as members of Congress who have sworn to protect our communities, we must unequivocally stand against every violent white supremacist ideology that is anti-immigrant rhetoric, Islamophobic, and anti-Semitic sentiment. With his face in mind in all that we do, Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. I now recognize the gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just last week, we witnessed here in this building, in the Cannon Building, Democrat members of Congress lead in radical, leftist, communist, and pro-Hamas terrorist groups in what we would call an insurrection. If January 6th was an insurrection, this was absolutely an insurrection of terrorism. They brought them in this building. We have watched, just as you mentioned a few minutes ago in your testimony, we have watched Iran's treatment of women, which is horrific, but I want you to know it aligns with the Biden administration's treatment of women. While they replace women in our sports, in jails, in our women's clinics with trans men and say that these men that pose as women have the same rights as we do, and they absolutely do not. And we have the Biden administration. Joe Biden, the president of the United States, wants $100 million given to Gaza, which is Hamas. That money will absolutely be given to Hamas terrorism. Ironically, $100 million is the exact same amount that Iran gives to Hamas every single year. There's so many similarities there, it is unbelievable. In 2014, during the Obama administration, the Iranian Foreign Ministry established what they called an Iran Experts Initiative. The purpose of this initiative was to build ties with a global network of prominent academics and researchers, including in the U.S. to improve Iran's image on global security issues. They have quite an image. As stated in your testimony, at least 2 of the people on the foreign ministry's list were or became top aides to Robert Malley, the Biden administration's special envoy on Iran. Mr. Greenway, isn't it true that Iran has succeeded in obtaining unprecedented access to and influence over the U.S. administration's policy toward Tehran?
It would appear so. It's in a twist of irony. The Biden administration has employed those under the control or influence of Iran to negotiate with Iran.
Isn't it true that at least 3 people selected by the Islamic Republic's foreign ministry were senior aides to Robert Malley, the Biden administration's special envoy on Iran?
At least 3, and he was pulled from his former position because of his relationship with Hamas.
And that's why he lost his security clearance, is that correct?
Insofar as we know, ma'am.
Isn't it true that former member of Robert Malley's Iran negotiating team, Ariana Tabatabai, was in close contact with the Iranian regime for years?
She cleared foreign travel documents and talking points as far as we know, Congressman.
Isn't it true that she participated in regime-backed Iran Experts Initiative, which was stood up by Iranian foreign ministry officials in the spring of 2014?
Yes, ma'am.
Is it your understanding that the Iran Experts Initiative was launched to bolster Iran's image on security matters like its nuclear program?
It is.
Is it true that Iran chants death to Israel and death to America?
They do.
Despite all of this, the Biden administration hired her as a top official within the Department of Defense, where she continues to hold a top security secret clearance, which affords one access to our nation's sensitive secrets. Isn't that true?
It is.
Is it safe to assume that the Biden administration may have been influenced by the Iranian regime?
It certainly appears that way.
It appears that way to me, too. Miss Ali Najad, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that.
Don't worry, I'm used to it. People butcher my name.
It's okay, mine too. As an Iranian American and someone who has been directly targeted by the regime, what do you make of the allegations surrounding Mr. Malley and others implicated in the Iran Experts Initiative?
It broke Iranians' heart because we believe that when it comes to equality, freedom, doesn't matter whether you're Republican or Democrats, you have to support the voice of Iranian people. He downplayed our cause, and he said that Iranian people want reform and respect from the government. So,
as a woman,
I want to add something about Ariane Tabatabai. While people in Iran were chanting against the Islamic Republic and wanting to have an end for this regime, she came out publicly saying that don't take Iranians outside serious when they say we want regime change, because protesting became part of Iranians' culture, and this is going to go away. And that's sad because thousands of people got killed and arrested for participating in that protest. It's not part of our culture. It's part of the frustrations of Iranian people trying to end the regime within the country.
Just one more question.
Well,
as a woman,
actually, we've got to move on. I'm so sorry. And I put this out earlier that I'm going to be tight on time this time. I think you may not have been here, but I have done that to both sides, so sorry. I now recognize the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Clark.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to everyone. Let me start by thanking our witnesses for joining us today. Ahead of the 2020 presidential election, Iranian actors posing as members of the pro-Trump Proud Boys sent threatening email messages to Democratic voters in battleground states, circulated a video that falsely alleged voter fraud, and gained access to an election results website. with the overall goal to undermine public confidence in U.S. elections. As was indicated by Ms. Alanajad, and certainly alluded to by many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, Mr. Warwick, my question to you is the 2020, with the national 2024 presidential election a little over a year away and campaigns already well underway, do you anticipate Iranian actors will once again attempt to meddle in U.S. elections through influence operations? And how do you expect evolutions in technology, as indicated by Mr. Garbarino and AI, will affect these tactics?
So you can count on Iranian attempts to try to meddle in our election. We need to therefore, as a country, be prepared to understand it, detect it, and resist it. I have to say, Iran, though, as an AI power, is dwarfed by China as an AI threat to the United States. And in fact, meddling in our election from Russia and China ought also to be important concerns of this committee. It's very important that the committee, on a bipartisan basis, encourage American citizens to understand, detect, and resist foreign efforts to sow disinformation and division in our country.
Thank you, Mr. Warwick. In the wake of Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine last year, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency launched the Shields Up campaign, which galvanized efforts to improve network defenses in anticipation of increased cyber attacks from Russia. Should we be concerned that Iran could engage in malicious activity in cyberspace to punish the United States for its support of Israel and erode public support for it?
Yes, absolutely.
Mr. Warwick, how can CISA's successful Shields Up campaign serve as a model for defending against and building resilience to potential cyber attacks from Iran?
So CISA's campaign was intended to encourage not the big companies that frankly can take care of themselves, but small businesses that are so dominant in our country and individual citizens to take the basic measures of cyber hygiene that are recommended by every technical expert and by CISA's experts. We all need to protect ourselves against these threats. Homeland security really does begin at home.
Thank you very much. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back 1 minute and 42 seconds.
The gentlelady yields. Thank you. Mr. Diaz-Zito from New York is recognized for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to everyone for being here this morning. Mr. Warwick, I'm not sure if it was in your opening statement or in response to one of the questions, but you mentioned that we need to increase our defense at home. So my question to you is, does increasing our defense at home include securing our southern border?
I really want to commend to you the supplemental proposal that was submitted for $14 billion to strengthen the security and efficiency of the way the border and immigration system works. This is a very serious effort. I'll be the first to tell you I think more is needed. Would love to talk to you and members of the committee about how that could be done.
That would be great. So the answer is yes, we need to increase our defense at home, and that includes securing our southern border.
I am always in favor of border security and things that can.
So I'll take that as a yes. Ambassador, I represent the 4th District of New York, which is probably has the largest Jewish population of any congressional district across the country. After the horrific attacks that Hamas launched on Israel, former Hamas leader Khalid Mashal called for Muslims to target and attack Israeli interests and Jews across the globe. We've obviously seen that. Given your background, what effects do messages like these have on individuals here in America who may have become radicalized and are in the shadows waiting to commit a lone wolf attack?
Well, Congressman, I share your concern about the rising anti-Semitism that has poisoned our public debate, particularly since October 7th. It might be comforting to think of anti-Semites as fringe radicals who occupy the shadows of our society, but in fact, October 7th has made them feel emboldened to come out and be more vocal about their hatred of Jews. And in some cases, their desire to see follow-on attacks, somehow even worse than what we saw on October 7th. And what has been most disheartening to me as a former university professor is the extent to which these extreme voices are coming from our elite institutions. When you have Ivy League professors saying publicly that they felt exhilarated by the images coming out of Israel. Exhilarated is not the word I would use to describe the decapitation of babies. It's not the word I would use to describe parents and children being bound together with wire and set ablaze. There is a sickness in academia, and I say this with regret rather than anger, because for far too long, support for the most violent and depraved anti-Semitic rhetoric, we've just turned the other eye, just turned the other cheek. We have to stop.
Thank you. And so, like I said, back home, probably one of the largest Jewish communities. And I am honored to work every day, especially as a former NYPD detective, work with our county executive, Bruce Blakeman, and our police commissioner, Pat Ryder, and the villages that fall into this district to keep our shuls, our synagogues, our yeshivas, to keep them safe. What else can be done, not only in the law enforcement aspect, but as communities? What's the messages that we can share back home in order to promote and encourage and actually keep these communities safe?
Well, I think the most important thing is the visible presence of law enforcement at soft targets like the ones you mentioned can have an important deterrent effect. We know that when terrorist attacks happen, that often inspires others to take matters into their own hands and commit follow-on or copycat attacks. If there's a police cruiser outside a synagogue, that makes it much less likely that somebody's going to take a chance. So I think starting with the basics, visible demonstrations of security are an important deterrent to further attacks.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Sheila Jackson Lee.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thank you to you and the ranking member for holding an important discussion. And I think it is important to establish the heinousness of the attacks by Hamas and the violence shown. And we in America should be steadfast and in front of the outrage of anti-Semitism and the violence that it generates. And we must ensure as well that as this nation respects all faith, that we tolerate no violence against any faith, including Muslim Americans. And I think in this committee, we want to have the homeland protected, and we want to be able to be honest and speak to those issues as very important, that we protect against such violence should not be tolerated. I am grateful, Mr. Warwick, for your presence here and all the other witnesses, and may I start with you on this whole concept of Iran using the forward defense. One would call that cheating and hiding. Cheating by having violence perpetrated, but hiding behind other groups. And forward defense is a nice foreign affairs term, but I think that is what it is. And so can you dig a little deeper into that strategy? And that is using Hezbollah, using Hamas, and other terrorist groups, and Iran either funding, directing, giving strategy, training, and how dangerous that is. And as a Homeland Security Department, Homeland Security Committee, how much attention we should give to that issue.
So I know the nuclear file gets a lot of attention, but in fact, Iran's use of proxies, that is to say, its use of military forces not under the control of the national government of the country in which they're located, is actually one of the gravest threats that Iran poses to the region, and it's the way Iran is trying to project its power against Israel and our Arab partners. This is therefore something that needs to be addressed in the most serious possible way, and very much should be the focus of a bipartisan, sustainable strategy against Iran that does not oscillate no matter who controls the White House or the houses of Congress. We need the same bipartisan, sustained approach that succeeded so well for us in the Cold War against the Soviet Union, and the bipartisanship we see in our approach towards China today. We need to have the same bipartisanship in our approach to the threat that Iran poses through proxies and surrogates like Hamas and Hezbollah.
We cannot turn our backs on that. We cannot ignore. And they can possibly recruit other groups and utilize them. The State Department has called them the leading proponent of terrorism. How much do you think Iran knew about Hamas' October 7th bloody attack?
They may not have known the exact day and hour of the attack, but they helped fund, train, and equip and provide facilities for Hamas to carry out some of its deadly attacks. So as everyone on this panel agrees, they are as responsible as anyone other than Hamas's own leadership in the deaths that were suffered on October 7th.
I think that should be loudly pronounced. So let me take you to this point. I think you will recall during the Obama administration, a very serious decision was made, an agreement was made regarding its nuclear assets. I can tell you that the members that were here, included myself, we had books and books of materials. We went into any number of briefings. We wanted to make sure that every line that we could ask, every question, every nuance was pursued, and finally felt that the agreement was the best way to go. And so my question to you is, you mentioned in your testimony that Iranian cyber attacks went down while they were beholden to the Iran nuclear deal and other aspects of their bad behavior. If Iran was following the guidelines, then can you just explore that concept, that there was an impact, and whether or not, and we probably, I hate to say the door is closed, but what kind of future potential any of that has, but mainly there was an impact.
Yes, it's important to understand Iran's peculiar sense of symmetry. It makes it understandable, and it should help guide us in our efforts to defend the homeland, because anything done to the Iranians, they'll find some way to do something similar to the United States. And this is why I say that deterrence doesn't work, but raising our defenses does.
And so your next steps for this committee would be what?
We have to encourage the American people to do more on cybersecurity, the private sector in particular. In many businesses, the small businesses, the backbone of our country, do not have enough cybersecurity protection. It's important for the American people to increase our cyber defenses. I'm not worried about the big, Amazon, Google, those companies. I'm worried about the medium and small businesses and what each of us individually can do.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlelady yields. I now recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Laura Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening this important hearing. The horrific atrocities happening right now in Israel by Iran-backed Hamas terrorists are heartbreaking. Israel should know that Congress remains steadfast in our support and our commitment to provide them with the tools necessary to defend themselves and the resources to eradicate the perpetrators of these heinous acts. This administration must recognize that Iran will not negotiate in good faith, bears responsibility for strengthening terrorist proxies around the world, and is still a state sponsor of terrorism. I want to be sure we bring to light today the human rights abuses being perpetrated by Iran against its citizens, and in particular, the abuses being perpetrated against women and girls. Ms. Ahmadinejad, I commend you on your courage in speaking out despite the threats to your safety and the danger to you. I'd like to return to your story because it is important for us to understand, to have a firsthand picture of the status of women and girls in what you described earlier as gender apartheid. Would you please share with us what that looks like for citizens of Iran?
It looks miserable. Imagine you go out by just showing a bit of your hair. You're not even sure whether you're going to go back home alive or not. Recently, the Islamic Republic actually beaten up a woman called Roya Zakari. She was unveiled. She refused the morality police. She got beaten up. And then they sent her to mental hospital because they believe women who say no to compulsory hijab, they are mentally deranged. Let me make sure that women of the Middle East, Iran, who can face these barbaric regime, they are the most stable women in the region, in the world. But yes, a regime that kick out girls from the age of 7 from a school if they don't cover their hair. If you don't call it the gender apartheid, then what do you call it? A regime that actually do not allow women to travel abroad without getting permission from their husband. We're not even allowed to go to stadium. We're not even allowed to dance. We're not allowed to sing solo. Women are not allowed to run for, presidential election. They cannot run the country. Believe me, we have more powerful women, educated women, compared to Rouhani, Raisi, and these killers. So women are being counted like second-class citizens from the age of 7. That is why I believe that Democrats, Republicans, you can get united and help us to expand the definition of apartheid in all international law to include gender as well. That's how we, the women of Iran and women of Afghanistan, we can easily fight back the gender apartheid regime in the Middle East.
What can we be doing as a committee, as a Congress, as a country? What can we be doing to help fight for the status of women and girls in Iran?
You can do a lot. First of all, as I said, that women received Nobel Peace Prize this year, Sakharov Award from European Parliament. But the real award for us is that you take the lead and ask your allies in democratic countries, first, to name the Islamic Republic as it is, gender apartheid. Second, support the civil society inside Iran. And third, instead of negotiating with the killers, negotiate with women, negotiate with the leaders, negotiate with oppositions, and be ready to see an Iran without the Islamic Republic. Because I'm being target of the assassination plot, don't ask me to go under witness protection, I'm not in a position to ask questions, but how many of you, if you face killers in front of your house, your government comes to you and say that, okay, we love you, just go and disappear, be silent. Would you accept that? How many of you accept that? This is America. My First Amendment, freedom of speech. I want you to help me to be as loud as I can, because I'm not here to save Iranians. I'm not here to save just my own homeland in Iran. I'm an American citizen as well. I'm here, like millions of Iranians, to save America from one of the most dangerous virus, which is called Islamic Republic. I know there is a famous expression in America, what happened in Vegas is going to stay in Vegas, correct? But what happened in the Middle East is not going to stay in the Middle East. The Islamic Republic is more deadlier than coronavirus. They're going to infect the rest of the world. So I want none of the Democrats, Congresswomen, none of them condemn assassination plot. It breaks my heart. When women were white, all the Congresswomen were white in the Congress, I was so excited. I thought this is because of White Wednesday's campaigns against compulsory hijab. So I want women, Democrats, Republicans, right, left, see this as bipartisan and help us to end this gender apartheid regime. This will benefit the rest of the world.
Thank you, Ms. Alinejad. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlelady's yields. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Swalwell.
First, I want to address what happened in Israel just a few weeks ago, and want to absolutely, in the harshest way, condemn the terrorism committed by Hamas. Period. Some sentiments do not need a comma. What Hamas did was terrorism. Period. And that says nothing about what the Palestinian people not affiliated with Hamas deserve. I also want to say that as Israel defends itself, which it has an absolute right to do, as a country that respects the rule of law, they also have a responsibility to protect and look out for innocent life, period. And that does not say anything about the Israelis' right to have a Jewish state. It just says we all expect that we will look out for innocent people. I also believe that at home, we have to look out for Jewish, Arab, and Muslim Americans who are unfairly being targeted as anti-Semitism and Islamophobia is on the rise. And that's something this committee can work on collectively. Also, as leaders in the Congress, we all should think about the space that must be created once the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is addressed to create a two-state solution where both the Israeli people and the Palestinian people can live in their own peace and have their own economic prosperity. And we should all strive to do that in the coming days, weeks, and months. I also want to talk about what the chairman said at the top as far as the Iranian people should be separated and distinguished from the regime. Mr. Greenway, you work for Heritage, is that correct?
It is, Congressman.
They're your employer.
They are, Congressman.
And you work there because you support their mission.
I do, Congressman.
And at the top, Chairman Green, who I commend for his statement, said, the freedom-loving Iranian people who are suffering under the repressive regime, that we must recognize we cannot essentially paint an entire population with one brushstroke. Do you agree with that sentiment?
I agree, Congressman.
On October 19 of this year, the Heritage Foundation tweeted out, the Palestinian population has no interest in assimilating into American culture and governance or in expressing loyalty to America or our allies. To import a population of Palestinians would be certain suicide for Americans. Do you denounce that tweet, Mr. Greenway?
I don't denounce it. I agree that there's a threat that constitutes open borders and immigration policies without controls, Congressman.
You don't believe that casting a broad stroke and essentially associating every Palestinian with Hamas is in direct conflict with what the chairman said at the very top?
I think everyone coming into the country needs to be fully screened and vetted so they don't constitute a threat, Congressman.
Do you believe every Palestinian individual is affiliated with Hamas?
No, I don't, Congressman.
Well, then why can't you denounce the tweet?
What I agree with, Congressman, is that everyone coming into the country needs to be fully screened so that we don't constitute an unsatisfactory threat to the United States.
On the same day, Heritage tweeted, America should not all capitalized, resettle Palestinians. To import a population of Palestinians would be certain suicide for Americans. Again, implying that any Palestinian who would come to America would bring violence. Do you denounce this tweet?
I think anyone coming into the country needs to be fully screened and vetted, and it's the policy of the neighbors of Palestine itself not to accept additional refugees.
So I don't disagree with you. I don't think anyone here disagrees that every person who comes here should be vetted. I don't support open borders. I don't know a single Democrat here who supports open borders. What I want to know is why you cannot denounce the idea that every Palestinian should be treated as if they're a member of Hamas.
I think everyone comes into the country, Congressman.
We're not talking about border security. We're talking about the sentiment tweeted that Palestinians, every single one of them, if they came here, would be certain suicide for Americans.
I think we've got an unacceptable risk of individuals crossing the country that have been screened and vetted, and it's a threat to every American, Congressman.
Okay, assuming you screen a Palestinian who comes here, do you believe that Palestinian should be treated as a member of Hamas?
I think everyone should have the same applied threshold of screening and security before they enter the United States. It's not currently happening.
Do you know that Heritage deleted these tweets?
If you say so, I assume they did, Congressman.
Do you want to delete the sentiment that you just expressed, casting Palestinians as all being affiliated with Hamas?
It's not what I said, Congressman. I said everyone coming to the United States requires screening and vetting before they are allowed entry so they don't constitute a threat.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Strong. Gentleman.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, can I just enter into the unanimous consent to enter the two deleted tweets on October 19, 2023 by Heritage?
Without objection, so moved.
Mr. Greenway,
The gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Greenway, I know you didn't get to answer that question. I'm going to yield 20 seconds to you if you want to.
No, I appreciate it, Congressman.
Thank you. I want to take a moment and express my unwavering support for the nation of Israel. The civilized world watched in horror as Hamas terrorists carried out brutal, barbaric, unprovoked attacks against the people of Israel. I stand with our great ally as they fight to eliminate the dire threat to their survival posed by the Iranian-backed terrorists. While the full extent of Iran's involvement in the October 7th attack is not yet known, this much is clear. Iran was complicit in the attacks, having provided financial, material, and logistical support to Hamas for years. I'm proud that House Republicans have unified and unequivocally in support of Israel, and I thank the chairman for holding this important and timely hearing to examine the threat of Iran, which extends far beyond the Middle East. Over the last few days, we have seen 13 separate attacks by Iranian-backed proxies on U.S. service members. As a member of this committee and the House Armed Services Committee, I find it completely unacceptable that the administration has not responded forcefully. Ambassador Sales, what steps would you advise the president to take to deter this type of aggression?
Well, Congressman, I think actions speak louder than words. We've heard just yesterday from the Secretary of State the right message, which is that if Iran harms American service members, we reserve the right to respond forcefully to defend our people, to defend our interests. But it's not an if. It's already happened. Reportedly, more than 24 American service members have been injured in the course of this rocket and drone campaign by Iran-backed proxies over the past week. What are we waiting for? How many more have to be injured before we restore deterrence? Do we have to wait for people to die before we establish deterrence? The way to avoid an escalatory situation in the Middle East, the way to avoid being dragged into a war, which we all want to avoid, is to enforce red lines with actions, not simply rhetoric.
Thank you. As my friend from Mississippi highlighted earlier, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence 2023 Annual Threat Assessment states Iran will continue to threaten U.S. persons directly or by way of proxy attacks. Particularly in the Middle East, Iran also remained committed to developing surrogate networks inside the United States, an objective it has pursued for more than a decade. Mr. Greenway, can you explain to the committee how Iran develops terror networks within the United States?
Thanks for the question, Congressman. For decades, and as I mentioned in oral and written testimony, the first assassination attempt conducted by the Islamic Republic in 1980 was in the United States, just outside the Capitol. And they have since built an infrastructure built on their surrogates and proxies that conduct operational activity, espionage, foreign influence, and now cyber attacks. All of that is expanded, and all of that, it seems, has been deprioritized, again, in the change in administration policies, and I think we're exposed as a result of it.
Thank you. Mr. Greenway, when you were at the National Security Council, what steps did the previous administration take to dismantle Iranian-backed terrorist networks, and how does that differ from what we're seeing with the current administration?
Thank you, Congressman. First, we denied access to all resources available through exports, through foreign accessible exchange, and through trade balances. And that, in essence, deprived them the resources to constitute and sustain these networks. Second, we prioritized law enforcement in order to conduct operations in the United States that would aggressively pursue these threats and apply the full range of law enforcement options against them. Third, we employed a strong and robust relationship with partners and allies to do the same. We didn't incentivize the taking of hostages. We penalized the taking of hostages. And so we didn't require the exchange of resources to obtain them.
Did you happen to see the statement of the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres? And I quote what he said this morning: Hamas attacks had to be seen in the context of years of suffocating occupation. What are your thoughts on that?
I think if we had heard a similar sentiment after 9/11, we'd have been offended, and I think many here today were offended by his remarks. The only appropriate response to the terrorism we saw from Hamas is condemnation and an absolute offense.
Do you believe he ought to be removed from the United Nations?
I don't see why he should stay in his office after making those comments.
I totally agree. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. It's an important topic that we should be discussing. Unfortunately, over the last year or so, every topic that we should be discussing always just kind of evolves into the southern border, no matter what. Meantime, we aren't talking about cyber security, which is very important. We've done very little about anti-racism, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslims, anti-Asians in the wake of COVID. All of that's kind of gone by the wayside. I've just been jotting down notes, and this is going to sound pretty disjointed, but the things I've been hearing from the other side of the aisle are so outrageous, I have a hard time putting them into anything comprehensive. If we want to talk about the southern border in relation to Iran's threat on the U.S., let's go back to 9/11 and the people who were the terrorists there. I don't recall any of those terrorists getting into the United States by swimming across the Rio Grande, pretending to be a brown, poor person from El Salvador. They came other ways. Maybe we should be looking at some other things that we should be doing to prevent these terrorists from coming into the country. Mr. Warwick, could you address that?
Yes, you are correct that the 9/11 terrorists entered through ports of entry, airports, and a number of measures were taken after 9/11 to tighten up that possibility and to make it much, much harder. Those efforts were carried out by both Democratic and Republican administrations, and they have been very successful compared with what happened before 9/11. We really do need to appreciate that Iran seeks to recruit people who are already here in the United States because it's much easier, as they see it, to do that. We need to make it a lot harder for that to happen. But the way to do that is to educate Americans, inform Americans, and be careful as public officials make statements. As you correctly said, we need to denounce both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And educating Americans in the kinds of things that Iran is doing to us for real is actually very important.
I've also heard the call for regime change, and sanctions work, but we need to do more. I don't know what more you want us to do. It's not been very specific. You've said, let me speak, which is happening. You are speaking. Support NGOs. We've tried to do that, I know, through the State Department. Are you wanting us to send troops? We heard some of the Republican candidates in their last debate suggesting we send troops across the border to go after the cartels, and we've heard here that the cartels are connected to some of the Iranian terrorists. Mr. Warwick, you kind of debunked that. Should we be sending troops? Can we send troops into Mexico to go after the cartels? Because not only do they have fentanyl, but apparently they're smuggling in terrorists from the Middle East.
There's a lot that can be done to disrupt the efforts of cartels to try to get drugs into our country. Many of them are in the appropriation supplemental request the administration has requested for inspection equipment that would do a much better job of keeping our country more secure from these drug shipments than trying to send troops chasing after mobile drug labs in Mexico.
We also haven't heard anything about the UN's collective sanctions expiring last week on Iran's ability to acquire and send ballistic missiles. We haven't talked about the JCPOA and pulling out of that and what impact that has had. Perhaps those are topics that should be addressed. We've heard about some problems in the State Department with having Iranian sympathizers, I guess, advising us, but we didn't hear much about President Trump giving nuclear secrets to a high-level Russian diplomat that we don't even share with our allies, and Russia's connection to Iran. Maybe we should talk about that. I think the only really good thing that I heard coming out was a reference to my district that what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Let me assure you, it doesn't. It stays on the internet. So thank you.
The gentlelady yields. Okay, the gentlelady yields. I now recognize Mr. Burkeen, the gentleman from Oklahoma, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What happened 11 days ago was pure evil. We know that we have 32 Americans that are included among those dead. We have 11 Americans that are we're hopeful there's going to be a positive outcome to their missing status. 1,400 Israelis that are dead, thousands injured, 200 hostages. People across the world are praying for a good result. But this committee hearing about protecting our homeland, we do have to talk about the southern border, and thus the reason for this hearing. You had 659 special interest individuals from Iran alone that came across our southern border in the last several years. I'm going to repeat that. 659 special interest aliens from Iran that have come across that southern border, and that excludes the 1.5 million gotaways. There are 70,000 individuals that are known as special interests that have come across the southern border in 2 years from over 150 different countries. The approach to our southern border, people say, well, you know, why should we be so concerned about that? The assassination plot to kill former President Bush by ISIS operatives, that was found out in the spring of 2022. I'll repeat that just so that people hear that. We had a former president of the United States that was under the threat of being killed, and that absolutely involved the southern border. Mr. Sells, you had some commentaries, a former State Department official, Homeland Security official, I found astounding. It was incredible information. In addition to this, specific to Iran, the purpose for this hearing, John Bolton was targeted. Mike Pompeo was targeted. These are former key officials that have been targeted specifically by Iran. These are people to be taken out. We had an author of a book in August of 2022 who was stabbed in New York City. Miss Alanajad, I hope I got your name correct. You personally have been the target of a kidnapping plot, and my understanding is an Iranian American. You had someone, when you were a journalist in Iran years ago, who was picked up in France, who was kidnapped and later killed in Iran. You had somebody show up at your front door with an AK-47 trying to kill you. There is an adjudication taking place within the United States about 3 individuals who have tried to kill you, tied to Iran. So that transitions me to my question. I sent a letter to President Biden. I'm grateful to a number of colleagues that have signed on to this letter. There's an attempt, there is a call. I'll kind of recite some of this letter. Dear President Biden, we understand there's an encouragement to bring Palestinians to be paroled into the United States following a Hamas attack on innocent Israelis on October 7th. In the past week, we've seen protests, cities, colleges across America. It's deeply concerning that these have put on the display and hatred against the Jewish people. There was a New York City Democrat Socialist of America who stood in the midst of one of these protests saying he might do the same thing because there's nothing left to lose. My letter goes on to call this administration to the fact that they are not granted federal statutory authority to do mass parole like they have done on the southern border, 30,000 a month with those coming out of Gaza. Here's my question. Mr. Al-Najad, because your life has been threatened specifically, can you imagine an administration embracing a concept of those out of Gaza, which we know from the Washington Institute polling says 57% of those inside Gaza right now, 57% inside of Gaza right now support Hamas or have a favorable opinion of Hamas. Can you imagine what would happen? I'm interested if we were to start granting those from Gaza access into the United States.
I mean, in my opinion, that a lot of people in Palestine, in Iran, in the Middle East, they really don't support Hamas and Islamic Republic or terrorist groups, but they are being like hostage in the hand of this terrorist regime. They don't have any other option. But honestly, I have to say that right now there are many Iranians in America, in Canada, they have a strong link with the Revolutionary Guards. Right after when Qasem Soleimani got killed, many of them appeared on TV and praising the Revolutionary Guards.
Just for the sake of my time, I want to specify my question. I understand kind of where you're going. Let me give you an example of what happened with Afghanistan.
Very quickly.
In Afghanistan, we know that the Investigator General has said to this administration, for those that were allowed through parole to come in the United States, that they lacked extensive background checks. Are you greatly concerned about, because they didn't have they didn't have names or identification specific to these individuals? Are you concerned about those coming from Gaza into the United States without being thoroughly vetted?
No, of course I want to do the background check. This is my concern, and I'm sure that many times that a lot of Iranians they just came without doing background check. Even the members of Revolutionary Guards, they were part of the delegation of Ibrahim Raisi when they came to the United States. So they have been given visa, but many ordinary Iranians, educated people, they've been denied to receive visa, including the family members of those who got killed.
Thank you very much. I
Gentleman
yield.
yields. I now recognize the ranking member for his closing statement.
Let me thank the witnesses for their testimony. One of the charges we have as a committee is to collect information from witnesses just like you and hopefully fashion some form of legislation that can support what we've heard. I still believe in America. I don't see us becoming a bully. I see us still as a passionate country that understand oppression by other people. And part of that oppression is to try to come somewhere with a common ground. And so, you know, we all represent 700,000 plus people. And I say that to say that since I've been in this hearing today, I've gotten several messages from constituents who want to speak to me directly. And I'm talking about today. And sometimes that's a challenge for members. And I can only imagine what the president is faced with, given his challenges and all he has to deal with. But I support our law enforcement. I support our intelligence gathering agencies. And since I've been on this committee, since its inception, I've never voted against an appropriation for it. I question some of the policies, but I believe that we have to invest. Under my direction, we created CISA, we created some of the other agencies that help us protect America. And I think we absolutely have to continue that. The Weapons of Mass Destruction Committee, all those things we created, but we have to invest in it. The president has offered some appropriation opportunities for us to help protect America. I hope we get support, bipartisan support, to make that happen. Otherwise, we'll just be forever languishing and talking. So, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you holding this hearing. And to understand how Hamas's horrific attacks against Israel impacts threats posed by the Iranian regime. The Iranian regime poses a range of threats to our national security. As members of Congress, we must be mindful that our efforts to call out and confront these threats posed by the Iranian regime and its proxies do not result in scapegoating Iranian people. We must also be mindful to condemn anti-Semitism and Islamophobia here at home. I want to comment on remarks made by Congresswoman Green that sought to conflate peaceful protests that took place last week with the January 6th insurrection. I chaired the January 6th Select Committee. What I saw in our committee over months of investigation says quite the contrary. And I believe in the right to free speech. I believe in the right to peacefully assemble. I'm from a part of the country that as a person of color, the law prevented that from happening until our federal government stepped in and created an opportunity that everybody in my state of Mississippi not could just vote, but could eat and sleep where they chose to. And that's the greatness of this country. And so I don't want to marginalize anyone. But what happened on January 6th was a travesty to this country, and that's part of that misinformation that some of you talked about here today. And it's that misinformation that causes some people to act in ways that's not normal and in some instances illegal. So facts matter, and I hope we understand that while we all have our magic 5 minutes, we are obligated to come with the truth. Mr. Chair, I appreciate you as chair. I think there are some opportunities for us to fashion legislation around this. There are opportunities to strengthen some of those agencies we have. I would say, but I didn't object, that some of the information shared was either law enforcement sensitive or almost classified. But, you know, if members want to run out here and say it, that's fine. But I just think that we ought to understand that in our zeal to make our points in 5 minutes, we should also take into consideration the importance of the responsibilities we hold as members of Congress. So with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member. I want to thank the members for their amazing testimony today. And I agree with the Ranking Member. I think there's a lot of good stuff, especially in these opening statements from every witness on what we can do from a legislation standpoint. And I'll look forward to working with the Ranking Member to put some of that to pen to paper and get something done. As we've heard from our witnesses, the threats posed by the Iranian regime remain significant to the United States homeland and our allies like Israel. The regime is the world's worst state sponsor of terrorism, utilizing its surrogates like Hezbollah and other terrorist proxies to conduct nefarious activities. The regime remains committed to develop proxy networks inside the homeland, which should concern us all. Mr. Warwick mentioned that the Iranian regime has not effectively connected with the drug cartels yet. They failed in their efforts, as I understood. But his implication of that is because of that, it shouldn't be a concern for us. I think that's foolhardy. Iran hasn't dropped a nuclear device into the United States, has not used a nuclear device in the United States. Because of that, that doesn't give us an excuse to just write off that as a threat, because it hasn't been done yet. I think that reasoning is flawed. I believe that our open southern border, coupled with the threats from abroad and from within, are a significant concern. In fact, I think they're a significant national security threat. Mr. Warwick also mentioned that the greater threat is from recruitment inside the United States, and I don't necessarily disagree with that statement. And you can look at our college campuses in the past week since this attack, and it looks like there's a pretty large pool of people to recruit from. That is also concerning to me, and I appreciated your testimony on that. I want to talk a little bit about policy for just a second, because we talk about how policy doesn't have an impact. If you give $6 billion to a terrorist regime, and then it's supposed to be humanitarian, we've got all these guarantees that it's humanitarian, and then a couple of days after the transaction, the very president, the leader, the supreme leader of Iran says, well, we'll use that for whatever we want, and then you don't take it back, then, that emboldens enemies. And, you take, for example, the insistence on the JCPOA, just continuing to negotiate this deal with Iran, who really, from my perspective, has been an enemy since '79 in the United States. When they took Americans and held them hostage for 444 days. Unbelievable. The Khobar Towers, the Beirut bombing, we just recently, I think, celebrated, it was the 40th anniversary of those Marines who died. All of that, Hezbollah, Iranian-backed proxies, you can't turn a blind eye to that and go cut a deal with somebody, because it does nothing but embolden them. A lot like the way we withdrew from Afghanistan, I believe emboldened Vladimir Putin to think that he could get away with invading Ukraine. Weakness is like it's provocation. It's like slapping your enemy in the face. And that's what I see from the policies of this administration, and I have to call it out. I'd be irresponsible if I didn't. We've also heard today from Ms. Ahmadinejad that Tehran continues to target current and former U.S. government officials, dissidents, journalists right here in our country, and this is unacceptable. Additionally, we have to secure our southwest border. As I've said, there's no doubt that the regime and its terrorist proxies could exploit the glaring vulnerabilities there. We know for a fact we've caught terrorists trying to get through, and that number has exponentially grown. Are we to expect that the terrorists are intentionally going only to the crossing sites to get caught? I mean, that's defies logic. In that 1.7 million gotaways, let's say it's just the same percentage. That's still one too many. We've got to secure our southwest border if we want to protect America. And I appreciated the comments about cyber. One of the initiatives we've taken is to try to get to a whole of government approach on cyber. I formed, with the approval of then Speaker McCarthy, to have all of the cyber subcommittees come together in a quarterly meeting. We've passed cyber legislation here. Our cyber subcommittee, led by Mr. Garbarino, has done some amazing work. And I agree, our cyber border is just as vulnerable and just as important as our southwest border. That cyber subcommittee is tackling the issue of workforce. We're 500,000 jobs short in cybersecurity. I noted some other recommendations in here on cybersecurity, and we're going to take those and go forward with them. And I appreciate the witnesses bringing that up. But we've got to remain vigilant to counter all of the threats, not just the cyber threats, but also the southwest border and the threats from folks being recruited here in the United States. I couldn't agree more. I too want to say to the U.S. members of the Jewish community, we will fight anti-Semitism with our last breath. And it should not and it ever be tolerated. And the members of Congress who are reticent or whatever it is to sign on to a resolution condemning Hamas, I cannot make an excuse for that. It is inconceivable to me. The members of this committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses that they will submit in writing, and the witnesses have 10 days in accordance with our rule, Committee Rule 7D, to get that back to us and into the record. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.